Let's see if they see us. Will they be quiet, or will we have to ask them?
I think I'd ask.
Ooh, what a well-behaved group.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dr.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. It's, we do this event because we think it's important that we help educate our patients and their families. So thanks for, spending your time with us when there's so many other things you could do on a Saturday morning. And also, this event is also on Zoom, and so you could have just stayed home and hung out and done that. But it's nice for you to come here in person, so thank you. So the format of this, we have multiple talks, and certainly during any of the talks, you can just raise your hand. And because these talks are all by physicians, sometimes they're, I even think that myself, sometimes I don't put it at the level that everybody can understand. So again, if you have questions, just stop us during the midst of it, and we'll try to answer them, okay? Because the whole thing, the whole importance of this is for you guys to learn something from our event, so thank you. Go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, I agree with everything Dr. Essner said, and I think each time we do this, we try to pick topics that aren't the same as what we've done before, but on the other hand, it's a different group of people than, sometimes each year, so we try to cover some of the things that are of the greatest interest, or maybe new things we've recently heard. And I agree, some of us tend to be a little more technical in our enthusiasm to impart the exciting knowledge and so forth. So yeah, definitely ask for explanation if there's something that's not quite clear. I'm sure nobody else would mind, as long as it's not a question about your own personal health, which you can do at the breaks.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So our first actually is the Melanoma Research Foundation. Debbie is going to come give us a little bit about that organization.
Hi, everyone. Hello. Oh, there's. Hi, I'm Debbie Churgai. I'm the Senior Education Program Manager at the Melanoma Research Foundation. First, I want to thank our sponsors, Castle Biosciences, Pfizer, Genentech, Iovance, Bristol-Myers Squibb, Merck, Immunocore, Ematix, and Regeneron. If someone's here from a sponsor, can you just raise your hand so we can please take a moment to thank these people for being here. They not only sponsor this event, they sponsor our whole patient symposium series. We do about 5 or 6 a year all across the country. And we are able to put on these events free for patients because of our sponsors. So thank you to them. Before I start, I just wanted to give a little, share a few facts about melanoma. I'm sure a lot of you already know these, but in 2025, over 212,000 people living in the United States are expected to be diagnosed with melanoma. Nearly 93% of melanomas are thought to be caused by exposure to UV light and sunlight. Melanoma is not just a skin cancer. It can develop anywhere on the body: eyes, nails, feet, mouth, etc. And the 5-year survival rate for stage 1 to 2 localized melanoma is almost 98%. So we like to keep things positive and let you guys know that you are not alone. It is the most common form of cancer in the United States. And there are over 1.4 million people living with the melanoma in the United States alone. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Melanoma Research Foundation, in case you're unfamiliar. It's the largest independent organization devoted to melanoma. We committed to the support of medical research to develop effective treatments and eventually a cure. The MRF works to educate patients and caregivers and the general public about the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of cutaneous melanoma. And we also include the rare subtypes such as ocular, mucosal, pediatric, and acral. The MRF was started by Diane Ashby. After 3 reoccurrence of her tumors, she realized that there wasn't a lot of options out there for her. And so she started the Melanoma Research Foundation. Our mission statement is to eradicate melanoma by accelerating medical research while educating and advocating for the melanoma community. A little bit about our footprint today. We host several events all across the country. These include 19 5Ks in different cities and states. We have 2 signature galas each year, one in New York and one in Colorado. And we bring people to DC to talk to congressional leaders about what is needed and why more funding is needed for melanoma. We host, as I mentioned, 6 patient symposia each year, and one of them is focused on the rare subtypes. So we have a variety of educational opportunities, not only directed at patients, but we create educational offerings for caregivers, family members, providers. Our education program includes educational literature, webinars, animated patient videos. We have a patient community forum. We have online educational courses, patient and caregiver symposium, rare subtypes, and a lot more. So we have a lot on our website. We know that education empowers patients and families to make informed care decisions, so we offer free resources for patients, caregivers, and providers available to download or to order for free at your clinics, schools, community events, anything you want. We have about 30 free resources all available on our website that you can order anytime. We host at least one a webinar every month about relevant topics that we can bring to the patient community. For each webinar, we always include an expert and a patient or caregiver. Actually, if you're interested in speaking at a webinar, sharing your story, please come talk to me. I'm always looking for patients that feel comfortable talking and sharing their story. So, and we are currently looking for some patients for next year's webinars, so please come talk to me. We have about 6 animated patient videos, 3 more in the works, thanks to some of our sponsors. We are creating some new videos. These are great resources. They're all less than 10 minutes long. If you have family or friends, I always recommend maybe letting them see these videos because it's just kind of an easy way to get a lot of information. And they're very colorful and fun and animated. We also have over 100 videos on our YouTube channel, including all of our past patient and caregiver symposia. The one from last year actually is on our website. The one from this year is going to be posted on our website. All of the Ask the Expert webinars I mentioned are available on YouTube. And we also have an educator course. So chances are if you have a topic you want to learn more about, we probably have something on our website. As I mentioned, we also have a patient and community forum. Conversations include a range of topics such as new therapies, rare subtypes, and how to handle grief. This is a great place to go if you just want to talk to someone who kind of understands the journey that you're going through. New to this year, this is really exciting because I've been working on this project for almost 2 years. I want to introduce our new Sun Safety e-learning educational curriculum for children. It's called SunAware. Students K through 5th grade are encouraged to build healthy habits and prevent melanoma, skin cancer, and sun-related skin damage. The program is completely free, and we are currently reaching out to schools to bring SunAware to schools across the country. So if you have any connections with schools, please let us know so we can contact them and bring SunAware. Research is at the heart of our mission, obviously, the Melanoma Research Foundation. We like to support scientists whose discoveries lead to better treatments, improved outcomes, and new hope for melanoma patients. This slide highlights some of the groundbreaking research that MRF has funded in the past and continues to support today. We have awarded 33 grants in 2024 and have funded over $26 million in research. And that number is likely to very much increase next year. And then this is a really a great, one of my favorite slides to kind of highlight how funding melanoma actually helps fund and advance all sorts of cancers. So by funding melanoma, you're also helping all of these cancers right here. Melanoma research breakthroughs have led to approvals in both targeted therapies for BRAF mutations and immunotherapy treatments for many, many types of cancers. And since the development of immunotherapy in the last 10 years alone, distant metastatic disease patient survival rates have increased from 15% to over 50%. And that's just in the last 10 years. This is a slide. We have a breakthrough consortium. It's another facet of our research, which accelerates melanoma translational research through multi-institutional collaboration and fostering the growth of early career scientists and clinical investigators. And as I mentioned, every year we bring patients and caregivers to the Hill to meet with congressional leaders. We also work with legislators and policymakers to help increase funding for cancer and specifically melanoma research. We had our annual advocacy day, I think it's in April, so it's coming up next April. We already have information about that on our website if you're interested in coming to DC and joining us and meeting with some of your legislators. In addition to our campaigns, we host I promise I'm almost done. But in addition to our campaigns, we also host a nationwide series of 5Ks, runs, and walks. And we have a ton of prevention and awareness campaigns. These are all available to learn more about on our website. This is some upcoming miles for melanomas that we have for the until February. We have a few more going on. If you guys are in the Orange County, California area, it's February 22nd. It's a really great event, very family friendly. I just want to mention, we were mentioning cancer today. The Cancer Today magazine is out on that table if you want to grab a copy. We got an ad in it with our educational resources, which we're really proud of. And then there are many opportunities to support the work of the MRF through a variety of programs, events, research funding, as I mentioned. We hope that you will take some time and visit our website and determine if you want to help and get involved or come to any of our events. Again, please follow us on social media. We're on all the social media channels, and if you want to learn more about anything that I mentioned today or any of our upcoming events, following us on social media is the best way to do that. I also want to mention that in the folders that you received, there is a survey. Please fill out that survey. If you fill it out today, please just drop it off with me on your way out. We take that survey, we take the information, and we use it to create the programs for next year. So I really do read every single one of your responses, and we use that information to create better programming for the years to come. Again, thank you to our amazing sponsors for being here today and for supporting this initiative. And also thank you to the Borstein Family Foundation. The Borstein family is here today. Thank you so much. And for St. John's Cancer Institute for partnering with us today. We hope you enjoy the program. Thank you again for being here.
My pleasure to introduce Dr. Batra. Sonia Batra is a local dermatologist, but actually internationally known. And so we are so welcome to have her because this is really a hot topic to us. As our patients ask us all the time, what does sunscreen do? How does it work? Which are the good ones? And so I think Sonia is going to answer that question for us. So thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Thank you all for joining me first thing in the morning and coming out for this in person and online. How many of you, just so I know in the audience, are actually melanoma survivors? It's a good number. And how many of you are caregivers or here to support someone in your family also? So thank you for coming out. I hope this is informative. As they said at the start, this is meant to be interactive. Please feel free to ask any questions. I'm going to try to make this as accessible as possible. I want this to be just like you're sitting in consultation with me, just talking about sunscreens and skin cancer kind of care to support your skin during treatment. So this is just a title slide. Thank you again. We were talking about risk factors. So we know that a number of the risk factors for melanoma are genetic and things that you can't control. For example, if you have an elevated mole count, especially if a number of those are clinically atypical, if you have a family or a personal history of melanoma, unfortunately, that's not as easy for you to control if you're born with fair hair, like blonde or red, if you have light eyes. Those are all kind of the phenotypic predictors, right? Things that are just genetically predetermined. But the two things you can control, which I'm going to focus on here, are early childhood burns and intermittent adult burns. And that's why sunscreen is something that it sounds like I'm preaching to the choir since I'm here, but also as a dermatologist, so I'm talking about sunscreen, but it actually can make a huge difference. And so this research has been around for a very long time in terms of the role of UV exposure in melanoma development. So we know that if you've had 5 or more childhood burns, that means before you're 18, that dramatically elevates your risk of melanoma. We also know that if you've used a tanning bed, and even just once a month or before the age of 18, that's probably the worst thing you can do in terms of your risk factors. So just something to keep in mind, especially for those of us who have children or work with children. That's a really controllable risk factor for melanoma. And then, of course, the intermittent intense exposure to the sun has been proven time and time again to actually be more problematic than continuous low-level exposure. So that's actually one comfort practicing here in Southern California, is that when I was training on the East Coast, people would go out at that very first sunny day in the spring and they would bake and they would burn. And we know that that's actually much higher risk than if you're exposed to a low level of chronic UV throughout. And so why is skin cancer increasing? So we talk about a lot of the cancers because of early detection coming down, but I think it's always relevant to talk about skin cancer because of our habits. And again, these are controllable things. This is just a typical day at a beach here on the west side, and so we see people spending a lot more time, leisure time especially, exposed. And it's not just on the beach, it's certainly if you're a skier or you're at an altitude, 80% of ultraviolet is reflected off of snow. So there are a lot more outdoor habits, and historically, if you didn't live in a sunny place year-round, you might have some protected months, but now because of all the snowbirds and the people who live in cold places and then spend their vacations in sunny places, we still see these numbers catching up everywhere. So it's not just in the sunny climates. We also know, sadly, that just because the air quality has deteriorated, the ozone layer is thinner, and so less ultraviolet is being absorbed in that ozone layer, and more of it is reaching the surface of the Earth. So it's not just the amount of exposure, there is actually more intense UV reaching the surface of the Earth. And then we know in terms of UV, we talk about like all these different aspects of it. I think people used to always focus on UVB, which is the shorter wavelength that we know to be a little bit more directly carcinogenic. And that's interestingly, when I talk about sunscreens in a second, what's super relevant, because your SPF factor in sunscreen is really only relating to the UVB protection. But we know the longer wavelength UVA is also much more penetrating, and that's what actually penetrates through your driver's side window and glass. So when people are driving and they feel like, oh, well, I'm in my car, I'm protected, that's actually not the case. And so that longer wavelength is actually very relevant when we start talking about true risk factors for skin cancer. And so I loved hearing from Debbie about the education, because this is something that I'm really passionate about, is that early childhood education. And we have a lot of great examples. This photo is from Australia's Slip, Slop, Slap campaign, and I think they've done a really good job inserting that early childhood awareness about the importance of sun protection. And I'm super excited to sponsor this Sun Aware. I'm already thinking about my kids' former schools. Now they're teenagers, but certainly in elementary school, it would have been really nice to have more programs that focused on this. Just to kind of remind them to seek shade, to be aware of wearing their sunscreen, that schools are on board with reapplication of sunscreen. I can't tell you as a practicing dermatologist how many letters I have to write for elementary schools to allow children to reapply sunscreen before they go out for recess, which is shocking to me, but I still do that all the time. So it is really important just to kind of remember that this is part of a broader public health awareness campaign. So even wearing hats, being sunglasses, self-exams, all of that I think need to be on people's radars, because the most important thing I always tell my patients about melanoma and any skin cancer is that the earlier you catch it, the more curable it is, right? And this is a devastating diagnosis, right? Like, it is still melanoma, the most lethal form of skin cancer. So we're always talking about preventive measures and early detection, try to curtail how much damage it inflicts. And so these were the images that still are very glamorized. I want to de-glamorize these, the being out and frying, the UV beds, the tanning, people who have tanning beds at home, which still happens in Southern California, and sort of like sheepishly confess to me, this needs to be really de-glamorized. So I think the education part of it is important. And then kind of also talking to people about just how you can still live your life. We all love being in Southern California. That's why we chose to be here. But kind of scheduling your life outside of peak UV hours is really critical. If you're a golfer or a tennis player, trying to set up those court or tee times before 10 a.m., after 4 p.m. when the UV index is lower is really critical. Seeking shade, like if you have a choice, if you're a tennis player, try to find that court in the shade. And I always talk to my patients a lot about this because you can still live your life and enjoy it, but just try to plan so that you're mitigating some of the damage. And then whenever I talk to my patients about UV protective clothing, I think everybody has this image of this guy in mind, that they're horrible, that they're not breathable, and they're really ugly, and like I'll be that goofy person. And I was that mortifying person with all of my kids' sports events. Like they could always spot me in the bleachers, but I'm very happy to say that sun protective clothing has come a very long way. And you don't have to go out and buy UPF, though that's really widely available. Like many mainstream clothing brands have affordable versions of UPF now, which just is sort of like an SPF for fabrics. That means the fabric itself has most likely been treated with zinc particles or something that deflects ultraviolet light. But if you're not going to go purchase UPF clothing, just holding any fabric that you're wearing up to light and seeing if light passes through it is a really quick, easy way to see if it is affording you actual sun protection. And so one kind of rule to keep in mind is like just a simple white t-shirt in and of itself is usually about an SPF of 5 to 8, and about 20% of UV light is going to pass through that, just so you know, like kind of out of the gate. But what's really been nice is to see that these UPF and sun protective clothing have come so much more in terms of the fashionable, the normal wearability. You see a lot of mainstream brands like Aloe and Lululemon and Uniqlo and Old Navy, sort of range of price points offering really well-created, well-constructed clothes. And of course, common sense. Like if you're going to go out for an extended period of time, wearing the long sleeves, as long as it's breathable and you're not going to overheat, is preferable to really wearing a tank top and being really exposed. So the other thing about hats is I get a lot of people who wear baseball hats and think that that's adequate sun protection. And I always tell them, like this was a quote from one of my attendings when I was a resident, that a baseball hat is really just a sign of affiliation. It is not sun protection, okay? It may be going to protect your forehead a little bit, but a 2-inch rim, it doesn't have to be an umbrella hat like this, but a 2-inch rim is preferable if you're really wearing that hat for sun protection. And then getting to actual sunscreens. So I don't really care what brand it is. I'm a fanatic about ingredients and how much you apply. That's going to be what's most important. So I usually encourage my patients here, I practice in Santa Monica, to wear a daily moisturizer with sunscreen. That makes it simple. It's not something you have to think about. It's just kind of part of your daily routine where you brush your teeth and you put it on in the morning. As I alluded to earlier, when you look at the SPF on the label, it's really only applying to those shorter wavelengths of UVB. So do look for something that's broad spectrum. Look for something that's going to afford you that full range, especially because, as I alluded to earlier, I'm always astonished by how many people say they don't get any sun, but then they have a 1-hour commute each way, which isn't uncommon here in Southern California, or their desk is right next to a window, and I'm thinking about all that UVA that's still penetrating. So broad spectrum sunscreen, really important. That just means it's really affording you protection across the spectrum, inclusive of UVA. And I'm a fanatic, and I always have been for about 25 years or so, about the zinc and titanium physical shields. I really like the micronized physical sunscreens because, as I'll show you in the next slide, they basically form a protective barrier that deflects ultraviolet. And so we know that they sort of stay put and they're more likely to remain stable in the sun. As sadly more data has come to light about some of the chemical blocks, we get a little bit more concerned about possible endocrine disruption. Some of them are banned in Hawaii. So I've historically always stuck with this recommendation. Now, all that said, if a chemical block is the only sunscreen you'll wear because that's what's chemically and aesthetically acceptable to you, some sunscreen is better than no sunscreen. So I'm sort of fine with that too. But if you're choosing for the true intent of skin cancer prevention, I always recommend the mineral sunscreens. And then the other thing that we often forget, and this applies to me as well, is to reapply. So remember, even putting on adequate sunscreen, it's really only going to sit there for 2 to 4 hours. If you're in water, you're lucky if it lasts an hour. So if you are a swimmer or a surfer, or you're just out running and you're getting really sweaty, you are going to have to reapply after about an hour. And that's something people often forget. They think they've put something on and then they're good for the day, and that's actually not the case. And then in terms of SPF, I think this is a common question I'm asked. And again, since we're only talking about the UVB, SPF 15 is already a 93% UVB block, and then the curve sort of levels off. If you go up to an SPF 30, you're at a 97% block. And I often tell my patients, well, yeah, SPF 50 is great. Remember, it's only 97 to 98. There's sort of a diminishing marginal return at that end point of that curve. So as long as you're at a 15, you're probably good to go. If you're going to go do an outdoor activity, maybe think about an SPF 30. But know that above that, a lot of it is just marketing, and it's not actually affording you so much benefit. Also, the interesting thing is that a lot of the mineral sunscreens sort of plateau, so you can't get to SPF 100 unless you're really using a chemical block. So that's something to keep in mind too. So I always like to mention that to people. And then this is just a schematic that kind of shows you what I was mentioning, where the physical block sunscreens deflect UV versus the chemical block sunscreens sort of convert it to heat in your skin. Either way, they're going to prevent burns. I see a question.
So 70 block is no different than 50 block?
Well, so the question was, is a 70 block different, or is it no different than an SPF 50 block? And the short answer is there's a little marginal incremental difference, but it's not a 20 as you might think. You're probably talking about 98 going up to maybe a 98 point up to the 99% range. So it's relevant if you think you're paying more or you're buying a product because of that difference. It's not affording you as much benefit as you might think. Yes, another question.
I don't know again if this is marketing. The other day I stopped in at the Brentwood Mart, and they have lotions and $150, $200. You know, this is the finest brand. Is there any, as opposed to $10 or $50, is there any truth that these high-end marketing brands offer anything in addition to what you would get for the over-the-counter?
So it's an excellent question, and the question is a higher or more expensive $150 sunscreen better than a less expensive $10 sunscreen? And the short answer is only if it's telling you it has other aspects to it. So now as we're kind of entering this more cosmetic wave of sunscreens, some of those more expensive sunscreens incorporate an antioxidant, or they might have other DNA repair enzymes. They may have other ingredients that drive up the cost. And so I think that's very much on a product-by-product basis. But if you're strictly looking for the sun protective aspect, if it's micronized zinc, you can spend $10. I'll give you a dirty confession, which is most dermatologists use just the regular $10 sunscreen. Because here's my issue with very expensive sunscreen is this. I'm going to show you my next slide. Well, this is just, kind of a nice example of when you use the sunscreen, make sure to get it on correctly. But this is why the cost is important, is that most of us are not applying enough sunscreen to get the SPF on the label. And so when you start going to Neiman's or to the Country Mart and spending a lot of money on that sunscreen, you kind of really hoard it, right? Like you have to think about whether you're going to allocate it out and actually use it because it's so pricey. And I would much rather you use that sunscreen with abandon, right? Like buy something that you feel perfectly comfortable applying enough, because most of us actually apply, one study showed 1/7 of the amount of sunscreen we need to get the SPF on the label. Because remember, when they're doing these assays, they're in lab conditions, and they're doing a gram per centimeter of skin. Like it's actually a lot. And so if you think about it, when you see this little schematic at the bottom, to get the SPF on the label, every time you went out in the sun, you should be applying an ounce, which is a shot glass full of sunscreen. Now, when you think about like the average bottle or tube of sunscreen you buy at a pharmacy, that's 1.7 ounces. So theoretically, if you went to the beach and you reapplied once, you would finish and need more of one full tube of sunscreen. So just think about that. None of us, including me, are applying that much sunscreen when we're out. So we're not actually even affording ourselves the protection we think we are. But just imagine then if you compound it because you spent $200 or $150 on that tube, then you're going to really think twice about getting through it in one day, right? So that's my issue with very pricey sunscreens, is that people don't apply them enough because they're sort of really curating their use, and so it's counterproductive. But I do think sometimes the price of sunscreen does reflect other things in it, and especially as some of these products have become much more sophisticated, they have a lot of really cool biotech-infused ingredients. But I think, again, just for the regular, if you're using it for your sun protection, cheaper, and, you know, SPF 30 is plenty. Sure.
What are your thoughts about the spray, sunscreen spray versus lotion?
So the aspect of sprays, they've kind of come under fire a little bit for two reasons. One is because when they're aerosolized, people inhale them, and some of those aerosol ingredients can be actually very toxic to your lungs. So though, as a practical matter, especially if you have children, sometimes the spray is the only thing you're going to get on them. So I tell people, use it outside on your patio or somewhere where they're not going to inhale the sunscreen. And the best way to use the spray is you actually want to go back and forth until you actually see a glistening of the skin, and then rub it in, and then you actually know that you're probably applying enough. But I think, again, something is better than nothing, and I've sent 2 teenage kids off many times for sporting events with zinc sprays, and you know, you try to pick the battles you're going to win, right? So I think it's fine with me.
Are there different components between European sunscreens and those that we have in the US?
Yeah, so the question is, are there different components between European sunscreen components and what's in the US? And the short answer is yes. And that's because of the FDA approval process in the United States. And there's been a lot of press about this lately, that our monograph and our approval process is lagging behind Europe. Most of the innovation in European sunscreens has been on the chemical side. So I do think that if you're looking for a more cosmetically elegant sunscreen, if one of the reasons you don't like sunscreens in the US is the finish, then take an empty suitcase next time you're in Europe and stock up, because the pharmacies in France are phenomenal. I love going. But I think that it's a very slow process in the US, and that's why we have less choice. Yes, Matt?
Oh, well, I have a hat story real quick.
Okay, sure.
The really bar hats that come down to the side really far.
Mm-hmm.
But the brim, if you flip it up, it looks like a nun's hat.
Okay.
And so when I walk down the street, the women really love it. They go, I love your hat. But with my guy friends, they make fun of it. That's the craziest looking hat I've ever seen. So you have to be prepared to have a certain amount of ridicule. And then I put the brim back down to look normal when I'm with my guy friends. So they don't make
Fair.
fun of me.
Well, I like that. A convertible hat still works. It sounds like Coolabar's sun protective line, as many of you may know. It's probably still going to give you a wide enough brim.
Oh, no, I just
But
meant when I'm with them.
no, got it.
No, when I put it up, it's when I'm not in the sun. When I'm in the sun, the brim is
You bring
down.
it down.
Yeah.
Fair. Do you have another question?
We've been told also there's a certain amount of need for a certain amount of sunlight, isn't there?
Mhm.
Vitamin D, I mean, listening to you sometimes, well, never go out at all,
Mhm.
but isn't it healthy to get a certain amount?
So I think that's an excellent question. And so the question is, isn't some sunlight healthy? And so maybe I wasn't being super clear. Dermatologists don't hate the sun. We hate sunburns. And I'm right there with you. I practice in Santa Monica. I love to golf. I like being outside. But when you're accruing the damage that's leading, unfortunately, to skin cancer is when you're turning pink. And so you're correct that the skin is a very efficient way to synthesize vitamin D, which actually has a slew of protective effects, including against melanoma. But there are 2 kind of critical concerns. One is that it's very hard to get the 10 minutes a day where you would synthesize vitamin D and then to stop and put your sunscreen on so you're not out to the point that you're turning pink or you're burning or accruing damage that leads to skin cancer. But if you're the kind of person who's going to set now with all our timers and all our electronic devices and ways to remind ourselves, if you're the kind of person who'll do that, I think that's absolutely fine with me. And then the second thing is the skin isn't so efficient depending on your skin type in synthesizing vitamin D. And so that's where dietary sources actually can really supplement and make a difference, like egg yolks and fatty fish and green leafy vegetables. And so there are many other ways to get adequate vitamin D. But I always tell my patients, like, look, I wouldn't live here in Southern California if I didn't like the sun, but I really am concerned about sunburns. And that's why those first few slides, when I talked about the intermittent intense exposure and the sunburns in childhood, that's where we really worry. And so I think it's okay to get some sun, and you heard it here from a dermatologist, but just be mindful of your practices so that you're not accruing damage that you regret later on. Perfect. Oh, go ahead.
Do you know whether, if you have, say, mucosal melanoma, are you more susceptible to getting the skin melanoma?
So the question is does mucosal melanoma or melanoma in any site really predispose you to another? And the short answer is very likely, because we know that you, especially with those rare site melanomas, and I don't want to steal the thunder of our geneticist, often have a genetic predisposition. So the short answer is yes. If you have even a melanoma in a sun-protected site, our best recommendation is you should be getting a full skin cancer screening as well, just to make sure that there's nothing else from a cutaneous or skin primary. Perfect. So I'll move on. In fact, I'm going to change gear here, and this is because last year I felt like I got a lot of question about supplements, and I thought it would be interesting to add a little bit of information about this. I think the most common thing I'm asked in my clinic is about nicotinamide, and this is because about 10 years ago, a really well-done study came out of Australia where they looked at supplementing 500 milligrams twice a day for people who had had 2 or more non-melanoma skin cancers. And I realize this is the Melanoma Research Foundation, and the jury is still out in terms of whether nicotinamide really can reduce the rate of melanoma development. In fact, there have been some conflicting both in vitro and in vivo studies, but I think the data is extraordinarily compelling for non-melanoma skin cancer. So anytime, my second board certification in addition to dermatology is Mohs surgery, so anytime I have someone having Mohs surgery at this juncture, now based on this data, this is a supplement I am recommending. Just earlier this year, they actually came out with the data on someone who's had 1 prior skin cancer. But I think that the reduction in developing subsequent non-melanoma skin cancers with a relatively well-tolerated B3 vitamin supplement is worthwhile. It's compelling. It's about a 23% reduction. And I think last year when I was at this symposium, and this is why it's so important to keep up with the literature, I was asked this question, and there had just been some data that came out about major cardiac adverse events. And so I had said I actually had put this recommendation on hold until we had a little more further data to elucidate that. And then lo and behold, this year, a really well-done study came out in one of the big dermatology journals where they looked at over 13,000 people, and they really didn't see, with this a well-done controlled study, they did not see an elevated risk of adverse events and cardiac events in people who are on the supplementation. I do still advise caution if someone has kidney issues, liver issues, or takes other medicines that are processed with the same enzymes. And there's kind of a long list of them, but the big ones that I think people take chronically are antidepressants. Some of them are processed in the same pathway. And then certain anti-infective agents that sometimes people will take will also interfere with this same enzyme. So I always tell people, look, like, before you just start taking this, please talk to your oncologist and your primary care doctor. Just make sure there's nothing you're taking that conflicts. But I think right now this is my standard of care for non-melanoma skin cancer prevention, especially in someone who's had a prior history of a non-melanoma skin cancer. The other supplement I always like to mention, especially because it's relevant to the sun protection part of this, is Polypodium leucotomus. This is a fern extract that's now widely available, but the dosage that's really come out in a number of studies is about 240 milligrams a day, and it's been studied up to 6 months. A lot of my patients have taken it longer than that. I always tell people this is not a substitute for your sunscreen, okay? So this is like a really potent antioxidant, and it's going to help reduce some of the damage if you're out in the sun for a long period of time. But I do think that this is worth considering, again, if there's no conflict with other medicines that you take, that this one at least will reduce the toll of the sun you're already getting. And if combined with sunscreen, I think it has a really additive benefit. So these are, oh, sorry, Kim, go ahead.
Oh, no, you can finish your
No, go ahead.
Well, you know, when you said it's a very powerful antioxidant, there's been many very powerful or not so powerful antioxidants that have been used in many rather large, you know, studies for prevention of various cancers or relapses, and some of them have had pretty negative outcomes, both in terms of preventing the cancer, as well as, you know, the possibility of low-frequency events that aren't seen in relatively small studies. I don't know what studies were supporting. So I'm just wondering if you...
So far, and that's an excellent point, this is the one that I've honed in on because study after study does show a benefit, at least from a skin cancer prevention standpoint. And I agree, Dr. Margolin is very appropriately raising, you sort of like read the headlines every day, and there's conflicting evidence as to the role of antioxidants, but this is one that at least so far has been robust. But as I alluded to, even with nicotinamide, you never know because the data sometimes progresses and you find that it's not an adequate recommendation. But as of now, this is still one that I feel very comfortable recommending, and I haven't seen any negative outcomes with people who supplement with this.
One question, why up to 6 months?
That was just when they did the clinical trials. It was up to 6 months, but as I said, I have many patients who have been taking it continuously, at least anecdotally, with no ill effects.
And is there any connection between the basal and squamous cell carcinomas and melanoma? Are they completely different?
So the short answer is they're completely different. So skin cancers are just named by the cell of origin. So dermatologists not very creative. Basal cells are named for the base cell of the epidermis. Squamous cells are named for the middle layer squamous cell in your epidermis. And melanomas are named for the melanocytes, which are the pigment cells in your skin. And so while we know that there are common risk factors like ultraviolet exposure, we think they're completely distinct lineages, and one does not turn into the other. And then I know I'm a little over time, but I think the questions were really worth entertaining. I'm just going to really briefly go through skincare during therapy. So if you are going through treatment for melanoma, this is another common area where people might see a dermatologist and ask, well, how do I support my skin and minimize side effects? And I think I see the most side effects on the category of the immune checkpoint inhibitors because they take the brakes off of your immune cells so that they can attack those tumors. But sometimes the skin is the number one sort of collateral damage in that equation. So this is the number one reason people have side effects from this particular category of medications. And so in terms of things you can do is just to try to minimize, and this is easy to visualize, other things that irritate your skin. If your immune system is already working overtime, I always tell my patients, try not to give it other things to irritate it, like fragrances, like colors, like stripping the barrier and drying yourself out. The more kind of gentle, hypoallergenic, supportive, this sounds really kind of intuitive and obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people sort of really up the ante on very harsh regimens when they're undergoing chemo, especially because or immune modulated treatments because they sort of feel like, oh, I'm at risk for infection, or they have other concerns. And I'm always saying less is more. Remember, your skin is designed to function as a barrier. It's designed to keep the outside world out. And so it's going to do its best job of protecting you if you're just super gentle with it and avoid other irritants. So it sounds like a cliche, but this is, yes, moisturizer to maintain your skin barrier is actually really important. And there's a slew of skin reactions during immunotherapy. I apologize, this is a very busy slide, and I will not quiz you on it later, but it just shows that the skin manifests many inflammatory patterns from immune checkpoint inhibitor medications. And then they can look very impressive and be extremely painful, extremely itchy. And so this will land someone in a dermatologist's office. But then in terms of my armamentarium and our toolkit is we're really very focused on trying to minimize any interaction with your systemic medication. So that's why the role of oral corticosteroids or systemic steroids is controversial, because we don't want to additively knock out your immune system, and we don't want to in any way add something systemic to the mix. So we really are going to emphasize that topical care. So that's why, at least even for the rash I just showed you, creams or topicals are always advisable from my perspective, and all that gentle skincare. I'm a huge fan of topicals like Sarna lotion. I have no interest in their company, but they make a very nice menthol lotion that has a cooling effect. That's a very nice one if you're itchy, and isn't even a steroid, so that's available without a prescription. Antihistamines go a long way, too, for the itching, just because they shut down some of that sedation or sensation, but they can be a little bit sedating. So that's kind of my toolkit. And then we also have some bigger gun anti-itch medications like gabapentin or naloxone if needed, but that would be something you would probably be seeing a board-certified dermatologist for. I have mixed feelings about the phototherapy. I think because we know narrowband UVB is also carcinogenic and increases your risk of non-melanoma skin cancer, but strategically deployed and thoughtfully deployed, this is another tool that can sometimes be used for these really persistent rashes in people who need to be on their melanoma treatment. So that's all. These are the two teenagers I referenced throughout the talk. If you've been coming to my talks over years, every year they get bigger and bigger as they're supposed to. Anybody have any other questions for me? Well, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sonia. That was great. So I'll go ahead with my presentation. So one of the topics we think has become really important in melanoma, obviously, is you gonna go ahead, David? Oh, I have to forward it. Is something called biomarkers. So what a biomarker is any kind of marker that will give us a clue of health. So in the world of cancer, a biomarker would be some measure of trying to determine, do you have cancer? Can we project the course of the disease? Could we determine if you're responding to therapy? And then finally, could we determine if once you've had therapy, is your disease coming back? So that's kind of the world of biomarkers. And what's become very important in the last couple of years is blood tests. And you say, well, that's been around for a long time. Certainly, we all had blood work for cancer for many, many years. But I think the concept has really changed with our ability to detect very small quantities of what we call nucleic acids. And the nucleic acids that we all know about is our DNA and our RNA. And there's different versions of that, which I'll talk about. So in the world of melanoma, as a lot of people here in the room know, is obviously it's a disease predominantly of fair-skinned people. And so you can see from this study that was recently published, it's a disease mostly in North America and Western Europe and Australia. And most of the deaths come from those populations. It's kind of expected. We do probably a little bit better. You can see like the deaths are not predominantly from North America. They're coming from other places, and it may be their ability to get access to modern therapies. It's not clear from the study. But what is important is part of this is that the projection of the disease, and the question is what's going to happen to melanoma over the next 20 years? And the suggestion being from this study is that the number of cases is going to continue to increase, and even if the global rate of the cases stays the same, which is kind of the darker, where the zero on the top, basically the number of cases will just increase by the population of the world increasing. And certainly the mortality, despite the development of new therapies, will slowly inch up. So again, it's important that we develop biomarkers because this disease is not going away so fast. So everybody in the room probably understands this picture, but from the standpoint of the dermatologist, patients don't show up with these pictures, right? As you know, as a patient, your melanoma doesn't always look exactly like the one on the top left. A Merkel cell cancer is a cousin of melanoma. It's on the bottom, and they all don't always look like this. So the images the tumors themselves don't exactly all show up like the textbook. And the reason I bring that up is because as part of this biomarkers and blood tests, can we develop methods of identifying tumors in a manner of which will help us find them sooner. So this is a pathology image, and I don't expect any of you guys to be able to read it, but this is what a pathologist is faced with is, they get a dermatologist does a biopsy. Typically the pathology is sent to a lab. They create this pathology specimen, and they're trying to figure out if this is a melanoma or not, or what kind of skin cancer. They don't ever see the patient, and so they're trying to make a diagnosis. And so, again, the reason I bring this up is because there's been a number of these are a class of stains that have become developed over the last 50 years in melanoma. And these are also the reason, again, part of the reason I bring it up is they're potential targets for a blood test. So if you could find your melanoma early using a blood test, one of these markers, perhaps that would help us diagnose melanoma early. And so the two on the bottom are probably the most specific, the most active. PRAME is used a lot by our pathologists to stain melanomas to tell that the difference between a melanoma and a non-melanoma, or even an early melanocytic lesion. And then BRAF is a very common marker in melanoma. It happens in about half of them. They're mutated. And there's been development of drugs actually to target BRAF. And some people in this room may have actually received BRAF drugs. And so, again, the reason I bring this up is because these are all potential targets for creating a blood test. And so another aspect that we're going to, again, this talk is predominantly on blood tests, but I just wanted to show you kind of how the world is evolving. This example of a digital pathology image. So the melanoma on the right, you can basically create a digital image, and each of the cells or areas become a pixel, and you can create an image like that. And the idea being is to try to diagnose tumors earlier. And then I told you a little bit about BRAF mutation on the left, and so could you actually use this kind of concept to be able to look at a melanoma tumor and tell if it has a BRAF mutation, which might lead to earlier treatment. So again, the reason why it's important that we create a blood test and biomarkers is this is kind of an example of what we have with melanoma. And this is what we're all faced as clinicians. So if you hypothetically take a group of melanoma patients, this is kind of the average, they kind of come in like 4 different groups. Group A is somebody that would have a melanoma. They show up. We excise the primary melanoma. We do the lymph node procedure, which I'll talk about, and they never develop metastases. That's what we hope for, is that, and you can see in this schematic, most patients are like that. But boy, wouldn't it be great if we could tell you that at the very beginning of your disease course, instead of having to follow you for years and years to come. The second group of patients is the people that we excise their melanoma, we take out their nodes are negative, we think everything's great, and then they recur later on. And so fortunately it's a smaller group, but really frustrating group because we take care of you, and we operate on you, we send you home, we follow you, and you recur, and the recurrences are on average about 2 years after the original treatment, and so it's completely frustrating for patients because for the first 2 years they thought everything was great. And then you have the other groups of patients, C, where it's, again, you operate on them, we take out their nodes, they're positive, fear strikes. A lot of these patients are getting treated with modern treatments now, and they do well, but they certainly have a long period of time of worry. And then obviously the worst group on the bottom, who we operate on, they have positive nodes, they recur distantly, and they don't do very well. And certainly that's a very frustrating group. But the importance of this chart is we as clinicians, we see patients, and we can't tell the difference when you show up, which group you're gonna be in, and only time will tell what'll happen. And again, obviously if we could tell you you're group A, we could do surgery on you, take care of your melanoma, and just say, go home, and you don't ever have to come back to us again. That would be great. And again, that's the majority of our patients, but we don't know who they are, and you guys don't know who they are either. But again, that's the idea of creating blood tests, and that's why it's become so very popular and to try to do this now. So I talked a little about nodes, and everybody here knows about the sentinel node procedure, which came out of St. John's, the concept of being able to identify the single draining lymph node and remove that lymph node rather than taking them all out. Started back in the 1990s, and again, it's standard of care in melanoma now. Again, the problem being with that, so this was from the original work from Dr. Morton, but it demonstrated that, well, if you have a negative sentinel node, so I know you guys aren't clinicians here, but in general, so this is a survival curve. And so you start at the top, everybody's at 100%, and then you follow people over years, and you can see this is in months, and you can see after like 10 years, most of the people that have a negative sentinel node do well, but not all of them. And on the other hand, people that have cancer in the lymph node, I showed you that group earlier, most of them do pretty well, but again, there's gonna be people that don't do well. And so, how can we take care of them? So we have now medications, but despite that, wouldn't it be great if we could tell them at the very beginning who's going to do well and doesn't need to be treated? And so we've done work, and others this is an example of a nomogram. So a nomogram, the idea being is you can take all their clinical information, put it together, and try to estimate what's going to happen to people. So this is like where we are right now, and there's lots of nomograms used in healthcare. We created this one. Others have created this. The idea being is, could you predict what's going to happen to people based on their factors? And so we use imaging a lot. And so like in our practice, we do a lot of chest x-rays. This is an example of a CAT scan where on the left, there's actually a tumor in the bowel, not showed up very well, but then we use PET imaging. And so we use PET imaging, but this example shows the problem with PET imaging because kind of in the middle is the tumor, but on the top is the heart. So the heart actually shows up just as well as the tumor, and so very sensitive scanning technique, but obviously not very specific for cancer. And so companies have developed tests from, this is again an example of a company called Castle who developed a test looking at the primary tumors. And so they've become pretty good at doing this. And so this is an example of a biomarker, but this is not blood. This is from the tumor. And so they've been able to demonstrate good patients and bad patient outcomes. Again, still pretty good prediction, but not great because, again, it doesn't tell you everything about every individual patient. So when we talk about blood and actually other compartments, so we can talk about, blood's on the bottom, but there's also, we could collect urine from you. We could get saliva, and one thing's missing on this is stool. So we could collect stool on you. And then you can say, okay, what can we get from all these different compartments? So I don't know if you guys can see it. So in the middle, so there's DNA. So what kind of DNA do we have? So, the DNA is our blueprint of our genetics. And we have 22,000 genes in us. And our cells spit out, as the cells die, they spit out their DNA. Tumor cells spit out their DNA, but normal cells spit out their DNA. We also have billions of bacteria in our skin. We have billions of bacteria in our colon. They have DNA in them too, and they can get in our circulation. And certainly we have DNA on our skin that we could look at, but we have lots of DNA. So the question is, what DNA can you actually, well, you can find a lot of it, but how do you separate out the DNA, say, from a tumor, from your normal DNA, and from the bacterial DNA? There's something called exosomes. Our cells break off little parts of themselves. They package. It's a way to move things around, so our cells spit off these exosomes, and they can have DNA in them. They can also have protein. CTCs are circulating tumor cells. So some of the cells, the tumor cells, they can live in the circulation. So a lot of them die, but some of them survive. RNA is what, I don't know if you guys remember from what science class would you learn this in? Biology. Probably in junior high. So our DNA is transcribed to RNA and then translated into proteins. So we have RNA in our blood, and we also have proteins in our blood. Some of those proteins do things. Some of them just end up there. I talked about the microbiome, so you have it from your skin, from your sinuses, from your colon. And so anyway, we have all these different things floating around our blood. You probably never even think about it. So how do you actually find like tumor DNA? And then what do you actually look for? So on the right, this table, again, it's really complicated, but it talks about all the different components of DNA you can find. I'll go back. So some of the DNA is going to be intact. Some of it you find because you'll find mutations. So I don't know if you remember back from the slide from when I showed you about staining, the BRAF. So we can find DNA from BRAF that's mutated from our melanomas. And so that's a target for us to look at in the blood. So we call that an informed method. And then we can look at all different alterations in the DNA, and you can look at alterations in RNA. Anyway, the point of this is it's not an easy science because there's so many different components of the DNA, the RNA, proteins that are floating around in our blood, and being able to pick out the tumor ones is quite difficult. And you hope your disease has an informed method. So in melanoma, about half of them have BRAF mutations that we could potentially find in the blood. Other tumors, you're not so lucky to be able to find them. And then there's other mutations that you can find. They're just related to having a tumor that you could potentially look at. So the reason I bring that all up, because these are 3 blood markers that are kind of around, but these are the only ones we have to date that actually kind of work. S100B, it's a marker on cells. This test is mostly used in Europe. It's hardly used in America at all. MIA was around for a short period of time. We never test for it anymore. And then we test our patients for LDH, which some melanomas can be a byproduct of a lot of different things. So it's pretty sensitive, but not very specific. But this is actually really all we have as of today that actually is clinically applicable. But again, the whole purpose of this talk is the science is changing really fast. And you probably hear about people talking about looking at tumor DNA and ctDNA, we call it, and there's a lot of work going on detection and also following melanoma patients. So that's part of it. But again, I wanted to just bring this up, the example of showing the other components of things you can find in the blood. And this was the concept of actually isolating the tumor cells and using magnetic ways and antibodies to be able to capture. So if you just try to do a blood test and see if you can find melanoma cells in your blood, you're not likely to be very successful unless you kind of find a method to sort for them and capture them. Otherwise, there's too few of them floating around. So again, this actually was done by one of the former fellows from St. John's. He's at MD Anderson now, and he wrote this paper looking at circulating tumor cells. And you can see, again, these curves they're like okay. The test is like okay. The ability to detect circulating tumor cells is okay, not great. We don't use it in clinical medicine. So again, this is the idea of using, again, blood. So circulating tumor cells, I kind of told you about there's lots of different measures of capturing them. PCR is obviously a method of amplifying the nucleic acid, so you can look at RNA, and there's a lot of different methods of that, so you can find tumor cells. And then, again, the way that's becoming way more popular now is looking in either you take the blood and you separate it out into the serum and the plasma. The plasma has lots more of the DNA there, it's intact. And so you can do DNA extraction and you can look for different abnormalities in your DNA. So you can look at mutations, microsatellite instability, so on. But you can look for different places that are defective in your DNA. And again, going back to the beginning, we have some DNA from our tumor floating around. We have normal DNA floating around. The bacterial DNA makes it in our bloodstream. So it's not an easy task. And then we've done some research doing another approach. We thought we could find melanoma-related microRNA, so that's not DNA, RNA. And so we've had some success with that. It's really hard because they're short-lived, these microRNA. So again, the whole idea of this is just to kind of give you an idea of where this science is going very, very quickly. Again, we can look for mutations, and so this is a study that was published now 10 plus years ago, but is really very popular, and it was really important because it demonstrated a lot of different tumors have lots of mutations, and melanoma actually is one of the highest. So it makes it a good target for potentially looking for mutations in the blood. But also this study was important because it demonstrated the concept that a lot of tumors have mutations, which suggests that they're actually targets for immunotherapy. And I think the slide from the MRF showed it, where the original work in melanoma, immunotherapy has translated into all these other cancers, and in part because of some of this work suggesting that lots of tumors have lots of mutations. So again, so I talked about it, you could use it for early detection, looking for ctDNA, and so there's actually work, you probably have heard some of this, there's several companies that are out there selling tests that are trying to detect cancers very early before you clinically know they're there. So early detection, trying to find circulating tumor DNA is possible. Use it monitoring during treatment, treatment response, and then obviously early detection of recurrences. And the graph on the right shows you the number of publications. So it's probably hard to see the dates in there, but in the last 5-6 years, there's been just an explosion of publications in the medical literature on studies using circulating tumor DNA. So it's a hot topic. It's not quite ready for prime time. This is kind of an example of ctDNA, a study. So number one, these studies are, most of them right now that are published are really small in number. So on the graph of the left, the red says if we look for a certain circulating tumor DNA before your surgery, and it's elevated, this is kind of what happens to you. If it's not elevated, you seem to do a little bit better. B is if we test it post-op and it remains high, you do really poorly, and if you're undetectable, you seem to do better. So it's not like a one-to-one thing. It's clearly, I showed you the graphs before from some other studies, and these they're not great yet, as you can understand. And so people are asking the question, okay, what happens if this is on the bottom graph? Can you guys see it in the back? Shows like if you're positive. So like, for instance, if you find circulating tumor DNA before your surgery, you do your surgery and you stay positive so that it doesn't go away, you're the red block, and you do very poorly. And then if you're positive and then you have surgery or some treatment and it gets a negative, you seem to do better. So suggestion that the circulating tumor DNA went away, maybe your tumor's gone. If you go from negative to positive, you seem to do worse. And if you, like I said, if you stay positive, you just seem to do worse. So can we use this as a method of serially following patients? And that's under a lot of study right now, because again, you can see it's not perfect. And so this is another example. Again, this is a study from just a year or two ago. On the left is kind of following patients, and they got serial bloods. And the bottom line of this is, in this study, there were people that would go from negative to positive, and they would then recur, and they were questioning, how much faster did you find the patients if you did serial testing of their DNA. And then lastly, just again, changes during treatment. So again, this is kind of a struggle. You can see all these different patients. You can see, on the left, on the top, it was negative, it goes up, and then it comes back down. What does that exactly mean? And how can we actually use it clinically? You can see even on the bottom one, it goes way up and then comes way down. So understanding this, it's not easy at this point, and it's not really clear. And the hope is over the next 5 years or so, we'll get a better handle on this, and we'll better be able to understand. And certainly, this is a recent publication. Can we use it to personalize the method of following patients, and can we predict the responders? And certainly, like I said, this is a very hot topic. It's like, as I explained, it's not easy to completely understand, and its role in medicine is certainly evolving. And this is an example of looking at bacterial DNA and how patients do finding particular DNA related to bacteria in your bloodstream, which is a whole other thing again, because we have billions of bacteria. There's certain bacteria that are common in our GI tract, but again, adds another confounding layer to all this effort. And these are just active studies that are going on, so there's a lot of work being done in this area. So again, the purpose of this talk is to try to give you kind of update, because you may hear about it. Again, there's a lot of research going on. We're trying to figure out exactly where it fits in the clinical role of our patients, but it's an evolving science. So thank you, and I hope it wasn't on the level that was a little too much. Len?
You've spoken about once the blood test of the tumor already, and you mentioned briefly about these new tests that tell you about a genetic disposition for all types of cancers, including melanoma. What is your thought about? My doctor said, well, you pay for this. There's a new test out. It tells you genetic disposition to get lung cancer or breast cancer, whatever it might be, and melanoma is included. So what are your thoughts on those, and if they're, why would one do it or not do it?
Yeah, so there's two different things. So number one, there's a the geneticist will talk about, like, what is your risk of getting cancer by the known genes that are typically from family related. So that's one aspect. The other is there's new tests, and like, for instance, there's one called GRAIL, and there's actually several other ones. And so they look at circulating tumor DNA from a number of different cancers, and they try to say, do you have cancer today? That's what, so they, for instance, GRAIL says we look at 50 different, we look at genes related to 50 different cancers. Actually, melanoma is one of the 50. And they'll say, do you have cancer like right now? Do you have an undetected, unknown cancer at this moment? And so the question with that is obviously its accuracy. And so there's studies going on both in US and Europe looking at its accuracy. And then also the question is, you know, how often would you have to do it? So if you don't have cancer today, will you get cancer in the next 2 years? Is it that much lead time? And then when should you do the test again? It's not yet clear who should get the test done, because I know, like last year we had a internist present about the topic, and he was pretty much told all his patients they should get it. Is that right, Kim?
And he said he picked up a couple of cases of lung cancer, but, you know, the key thing is, does it help? Does it help people? You can detect stuff. What does it mean? What more proof do you need? And will those early interventions make people live longer and better? So you got to follow the entire, train ride.
So the problem is that they haven't been compared to like mammography for women, colonoscopy, screening, or even now we screen people for lung cancer based upon, certain risks. We use non-contrast CT scan. So those tests haven't been compared to that. So we don't even know exactly how they fit, but people are out there using them. And that's probably what you were asked about. And I'm not sure Medicare pays for it yet. I don't think so.
No,
Yeah, because Medicare is part of the study. There's 2 studies in the US, and there's one in Great Britain actually trying to look at the utility of one of them. GRAIL is the most common one, but there's a couple other companies have the same kind of tests.
We have a few questions online. One is, what is the common biomarker used to test melanoma or combination of?
Yeah, so the most common informed one is BRAF, but that only is in about half of the melanoma patients have a mutated BRAF, and then there's other ones that are much less common. So the way that these tests usually run is they'd like to get your tumor and see what mutation they can find from the tumor, and then look to see if you can find the same one in the blood. So that's an informed test. Sometimes you're not that lucky that you have the primary tumor, and so then you go looking for the ones that you think might be there, and so it makes it much harder.
And then we have one more question, kind of a general question. How does age impact the development of skin cancer? Clearly, the skin shows notable changes, deterioration with age.
Yeah, I mean, melanoma is interesting because the average age of our patients is around 50. So you wonder, like, okay, so you got your sun injury in your youth. Why is there such a lag period? And then why don't we see more cases? You'd think you get more cases as you get older. And so, but that doesn't happen. Like the incidence is, like I said, it's the peak, I think is around 50 to 55. So it's not clear why that seems to be the peak. Why don't you you would think it would just keep getting higher and higher, right? You'd think that, 20% of 90-year-olds would have melanoma, but it's not the case. Do you have anything to say, Sonia?
I would add on to that. I think there's 2 factors with respect to age. There's different peaks between the melanoma and the non-melanoma skin cancer. So melanoma, sadly, is devastating for young people. It's the #1 most lethal cancer from 25 to 34, actually. So in that respect, we do see this earlier peak that Rick was mentioning. And then that, I think, is because it's an interplay of those childhood sunburns, genetics, habits, all of it. And then the peak age for the non-melanoma skin cancer is 62, and that's actually going up because people are living longer. And we think that there's more of a role for those cancers in cellular immunity, so the role of your immune system and its surveillance, as well as just cumulative exposure because people are living longer. But sadly, the risk keeps going up of lifetime because people are living longer. And I think the very first slide Debbie you presented was skin cancer, sadly, is the #1 cancer of any type in the United States right now. And it's more than breast, lung, colon, and prostate cancer combined. But it just doesn't get the press, thankfully, because most forms of skin cancer are curable.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so any other questions? And otherwise, go ahead.
I was just wondering on the ctDNA testing, I know that is still being developed, but it's got a pretty good record in melanoma, correct?
Well, I kind of showed you some of the literature. Yes. And the literature is like, okay, it's not great yet. Okay. So in our clinical practice, we try to incorporate it in, and we've had a hard time doing it because we've had examples where it just, false negatives, and we've had false positives. So we're not sure exactly how to use it. And you saw that from those curves. I know those are scientific derived curves, but you saw it like the tests, it's not perfect. Like if you're negative, it doesn't mean you're gonna survive, 100%. And if you are positive, you persist, it doesn't mean everybody dies. So I don't think anybody understands that yet. And again, there's no perfect test. So trying to figure out how do we incorporate them into our practice has been pretty difficult for us because it's not clear exactly, we don't have enough confidence to be able to change people's treatment based upon these tests, at least not yet.
Okay, and that's primarily for people that had a tumor sample sent to the testing companies, so they're trying to match what's floating around in the blood with what the tumor had shedding or whatever. What about for people, there's some people in a group I'm in, and they've had their surgery like 5 or 10 years ago, and they're still clear, there's still no evidence of disease, but they're wondering, when is it going to get to the point maybe, or is it already to the point where people can have the ctDNA test and not have a tumor sample to match up?
Well, it happens today because, for instance, like the melanoma tumors are often really small, and so we can't get the primary tumor, or we can't get access to it. It's like in some lab somewhere. So a lot of the, some of it's, we call it agnostic. So the companies will take genes they predict that could be in your melanoma, and they'll use those. That's what they'll aim for. Because you can't just obviously you can't run 22,000 genes. So there's not 22,000 cancer genes. There's probably, a couple hundred tumor-associated genes. And so you could do that, but if you could try to make it even less, so that's what they try to do. So they'll do their best, like in melanoma, if they don't have the primary, they'll run the genes they expect to be in melanoma.
Okay, so they could get their doctor.
They might look at 100 genes.
Okay, 100 genes. Okay, thank you.
Those who are here will have the treat of listening to Ashley Salazar Kardashian, who will be talking about dietary intervention. I don't know what the exact title is, but it's something to the effect of dietary interventions in melanoma. So please welcome Ashley.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley. I'm a dietitian at Providence St. John's Health Center. I see both inpatient and outpatient patients, but primarily my main population is the oncology population. So today, sorry, we got a little ahead of ourselves there. Today we'll be talking about kind of like what the current research says about nutrition and how it affects melanoma. So as others have said, melanoma is the rarest type of skin cancer. It only accounts for 1% of all skin cancer rates, but it causes the majority of of deaths. It's the most deadly and most fatal, just because it can spread very rapidly, and that makes it hard to kind of pinpoint treatment. So today we'll talk about kind of a few things and what affects melanoma. So how your weight affects melanoma, certain food types, and then kind of ending it with like a summary of what we should eat, right? So first and foremost, we know that maintaining a healthy weight at any age is one of the most important things for general cancer prevention. Sorry, can you hear me? Is it better with the microphone? For general cancer prevention. Obesity is associated with a significant metabolic and endocrine abnormalities. You do see a lot of increases in growth factors in the blood, including insulin and insulin-like growth factor 1, which can promote tumor cell growth and survival. It's also been shown that adipocytes or fat cells can also promote tumor growth in the sense that it's like a slow release of cytokines with that low-grade inflammation that we see with obesity. One of the studies have shown that overweight and obese patients, specifically men, carry a 31% increased risk of developing malignant melanoma. A lot of studies find this like obesity paradox. And so you can see that from the BMIs of around 22 to 32, your relative risk for melanoma actually goes down, but it does go back up after the 33, 34 mark. Red and processed meats, this was very interesting to me because a lot of times red and processed meats we know are basically when you're cooking and processing them, you're producing nitrates and nitrites, which are based on the World Health Organization's Agency of Research on Cancer. They classified consumption of processed meats and red meats as carcinogenic. But there's this study that actually showed that that red and processed meat intake, a higher intake, actually had a known protective effect. And I put protective in quotations just because I feel like it's very preliminary research. And it has been shown to, like the consumption of red and processed meats has been shown to actually increase your risk for other cancers, including colorectal and stomach cancers. But it kind of begs the question, is there some component in red meat that is actually protective against melanoma? Well, we do know, and the studies showed that it contains retinol, which has been shown to be more an inhibitory effect on tumor promotion. And it's also a source of nicotinamide, which Dr. Batra also mentioned it's that kind of the component of vitamin B3 that is also, it actually has immunoprotective properties against UV radiation, right? And it's just interesting to see the results just because, it's not something that is recommended to increase your consumption of red or processed meats, but there is some components in these things that are quote unquote protective. Alcohol was across the board. It was a consensus that it did increase your risk for melanoma by about 20%. And the type of beverage actually mattered. So white wine consumption and liquor actually had higher increases for melanoma risk. And alcohol kind of across the board, like I said, for all cancers, have an increased risk for cancer. The IACR actually classifies it as a class 1 carcinogenic as well. So lowering your alcohol consumption is recommended. Coffee and tea are the other one. So studies did find that a higher intake of caffeinated coffee is associated with about a moderate risk reduction in melanoma risk. Tea actually found no association. But as you can see in the chart, coffee does have a higher polyphenol, which is an antioxidant. It's essentially a protective effect against those reactive oxygen species. And so coffee does have a higher polyphenol content compared to the teas. The coffee is in red and then the teas are in green. So that may be a explanation, but that doesn't take away the fact that tea still does contain certain polyphenols, especially green tea. Next is polyunsaturated fats. And so these PUFAs, as I call them, are contained in plant and fatty fish-derived oils, and they include omega-6 and omega-3s. There's strong evidence that omega-3 fatty acids actually have an overall effect on, overall protective effect on overall cancer, especially the higher ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s. Certain studies found that a higher omega-6 PUFA intake was actually associated with an increased risk of melanoma in 2 cohort studies. Although one of the largest melanoma genome-wide association studies concluded that increased PUFA intake actually had like a null or no effect, very small effect on melanoma risk. But the well-known research does say that an increase in omega-3s does promote a reduced risk. And this is intake. Maybe we can go into it a little bit later for time's sake, but this is where you get like your fatty fish, salmon, mackerel, herring, sardines, anchovies. There's a plant-based form called ALA, alpha-linoleic acid, but the absorption capacity is a lot lower, and this is where you get your omega-3s from flax seeds, walnuts, chia seeds. But if you're relying on those sources of omega-3, you're better off either taking a fish oil supplement or, if you're vegan, maybe a microalgae supplement. So let's talk about reactive oxidation species. We're going to go into a few antioxidants. And in order to explain how those antioxidants kind of work in the body, let's talk about how they protect us from these things. And so oxidative stress is a state of imbalance between the production of these ROSs and the ability of the cells to detoxify or repair their damage. They can be a byproduct of cellular metabolism, but we can also get them from the environment. Excess ROS production can lead to oxidative stress, which can cause cellular damage and then ultimately to cellular dysfunction, as you can see in the chart, in the picture. And this is kind of how cancer can start. A lot of the main ROS damage that we get from skin cancer or melanoma is that sun damage. So antioxidants are essentially kind of, they function by eliminating free radicals and neutralizing those ROS. This is kind of a cute picture of kind of explaining that. So they're neutralizing that free radical into a happier, healthier atom. So today we'll dive into kind of a few antioxidants and see what their role is with melanoma. Vitamin C is the first one. Vitamin C you mostly get from things like oranges, like a lot of citrus fruits, oranges, grapefruits, limes, lemons. And so a lot of studies for these antioxidants have not been done in humans. And so I'll just kind of start with that. A lot of them are in vitro and the results are kind of inconclusive. But in vitro, the intake of vitamin C foods actually showed a toxic and pro-apoptotic and anti-proliferative properties against melanoma. but certain components in vitamin C foods called psoralins are actually known to sensitize the skin to UVA radiation. So it's interesting. It actually showed a protective effect due to that neutralizing of those free radicals, but there are certain components that actually sensitize the skin as well. These psoralins were actually used in tanning beds as tanning activators in the 90s until they were discontinued. So one of the studies, it's a 2015 study that was more based on food frequency questionnaire. They did find that an increased risk of melanoma actually with higher citrus intake, which was more than 1.6 times a day. And primarily the higher risk was for grapefruit and orange juice. So grapefruit number 1 and then orange juice number 2. Again, it's just in vitro studies and mostly population food frequency questionnaires, right? And so research is still a little inconclusive, but these psoralins kind of sensitize, because they sensitize the skin. I will say that kind of piggybacking off of our dermatologist presentation, like there's nothing that replaces sun protection, right? So the next one is vitamin D. It's the best researched. Vitamin D is a prohormone, right? And so its active form is produced after being hydrolyzed in the liver and kidneys. We either absorb it through the sun or through food sources. Food is pretty, the absorption capacity that you get from vitamin C from food is pretty low. It's only about 10 to 20%. And so most of it is actually from the sun. And that's kind of conflicting, right? Because the main source of vitamin D production, like what was talked about with the dermatologist, Dr. Batra, is also the main source of sun damage, right? And kind of increases your risk for skin cancer. A lot of times, I think the research is still inconclusive because of that. You kind of have to factor out a lot of the sun, like the sun exposure in a lot of these population-based studies. What is a consensus all around in the literature is they found that a vitamin D deficiency actually increased your risk for melanoma I'm sorry. So, it's kind of, you don't need to supplement in excess or stay a ton of time in the sun. But getting adequate vitamin D, right, is definitely protective against melanoma versus being in a deficient state. Vitamin A is the next one. And so these are also a group of fat-soluble vitamins called retinoids. And the subgroups include retinol, retinaldehyde, and carotenoids. One of the meta-analyses observational studies reported a 20% reduced risk of melanoma with higher intake of retinol, as you can see here, but it was actually a null or small effect with total vitamin A consumption and carotenoid. So retinol was enough to increase to reduce your risk, but not the total vitamin A or the carotenoid intake. It's interesting to note that vitamin A activity in beta carotene is only about 1/12 of that in retinol, right? So it could just be that the beta carotene was not enough. It wasn't protective enough compared to retinol. Vitamin E is the next one. This is also a fat-soluble vitamin, mainly represented by tocopherols and tocotrienols, both of which have shown photoprotective and antioxidant properties in vitro. A study showed that subjects in the higher quantile of vitamin E intake from food actually displayed a lower melanoma risk, but the statistical model assumed a linear dose-response relationship, so that higher intake of vitamin E you ate, the lower your risk, and that was not the case, right? There was still kind of a plateau or a cap. And I don't know, you can't really see very well in this icon, but one of the reasons that vitamin E could be protective is that it has a role. The little green parts are the little components of vitamin E, has a role in the cancer immunity cycle. And so as you can see, there are a lot of effects that kind of either prevent cancer progression or promote those sort of cancer protective properties in a cell, right? Even so, most of the research is kind of inconclusive or done mostly in vitro, and so we can't really make any claims. So that's mainly for vitamin E. Some spices also are very popular, turmeric and ginger. I have a lot of patients, either taking supplements or like drinking kind of like those immunity shots or teas. And so both are kind of natural flavonoids, right, which are antioxidants. Very preliminary, either in vitro or animal studies have shown that they have a protective effect. But again, it hasn't really been studied. There hasn't really been a human study done. And so we can't really claim that it has, protective effects for melanoma, but it has preliminary evidence. So very small effect. These specific diets, the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet, which I kind of categorized as mostly plant-based diets, have the most research and kind of like the most data that they are protective. So the Mediterranean diet is characterized by a higher consumption of plant foods, vegetables, legumes, fruits, whole grains, and healthy fats like olive oil, right? It has a moderate to low consumption of fish, meat, dairy products, added sugar, and wine. You see a lot of intake of MUFAs or monounsaturated fatty acids, which are the other sister kind of the PUFAs. Polyphenols, right? All of the colors essentially that you see in vegetables and fruits are those antioxidants. And a higher adherence to this Mediterranean diet actually found lower incidences of melanoma. The DASH diet also, it's similarly characterized by a higher intake of fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, whole grains, and a lower consumption of sodium and like higher fat meats. An Italian population-based case control study found an inverse relationship with higher DASH adherence and melanoma risk in both sexes, so men and women. So these have been shown to reduce your risk, and it's a little bit more of a kind of a wider kind of topic as opposed to specific antioxidants, but it is interesting to note that these diets have antioxidants or food components that have antioxidants, right? So healthier fats, fruits, vegetables, and actually a lower consumption of the red meat, right? So this is kind of to summarize. Obesity showed an increased risk for melanoma, particularly in males. Mediterranean and DASH diets showed lower incidences, particularly in females lower than 50 years. Red and processed meats, early research showing a protective effect, primarily because of the retinol and the nicotinamide. Alcohol intake across the board showed an increased risk, especially with consumption of white wine and liquor. Coffee and tea showed a reduced risk with coffee and no confirmed association with tea. PUFAs showed a reduced risk with omega-3, PUFAs specifically, and an increased risk with omega-6s, which is the more pro-inflammatory fatty acid. Vitamin C showed increased risk of showed an increased melanoma risk with higher intakes of vitamin C from citrus fruits, but it did show a protective effect with certain population types, like phenotypes, the skin phenotypes 2 and 3, which are like the lighter skin phenotypes. Vitamin D showed a very null or protective effect in women and men, but confirmed association, higher risk of melanoma with deficiency. Vitamin A reduced risk with higher retinol intake only, not beta-carotene or carotenoids and total vitamin A. And then vitamin E is kind of, because it's preliminary studies, it's a null effect. And then turmeric and ginger, small effect in vitro, okay? So all that to say kind of what do I eat, right? And that's when I will go to the American Institute for Cancer Research recommendations for cancer prevention. A lot of it is more of a broad-based generalization, but it kind of hones down, certain food patterns and diets to follow. And so it does say, eating a diet rich in whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and beans, right? Which we see in the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. Those whole grains, beans, vegetables, fruits also show a higher intake of antioxidants, right? Limiting consumption of red and processed meats, limiting consumption of fast foods and other foods high in fats, starches, or sugars, being at a healthy weight, being physically active, which we didn't talk about just for time's sake. Also not talked about, but very, very important, I should say, limiting consumption of sugary sweetened drinks, and then limiting alcohol consumption. You could see for cancer prevention, it's best not to drink alcohol, right? So this kind of shows like a plate, and how to have your plate for meals. This kind of replaced the food pyramid, right? That was like very well understood. But the AICR has developed a diet that actually puts plant foods first. So again, we're highlighting those plant foods. And the New American plate calls for filling your plate with half vegetables, mostly just like a quarter of it being protein. Usually I like to say the size of your palm, and then choosing whole grains on another quarter of your plate or the size of your fist, right? And so this can kind of summarize kind of like portions on your plate. That's all the time we have today, but thank you so much for your time and for being here. And I can take any questions, unless we want to move on with time. Sure.
It's more of a comment than a question, but I think it was in the middle of the bottom of your last slide. I think we get asked a lot about, those of us who are in the so-called trenches of taking care of patients who had melanoma and skin cancer, but mostly melanoma. What diet should I follow? What environmental, but mainly diet, not to get it again, not to get a relapse or not to get another. And look in the middle, it says check with your professional. Well, the professional probably doesn't know, because that's not going to necessarily be me, but I think it's really important to stress that everything you said is about prevention of the first cancer, the first melanoma, the first anything, and for consideration of having it not come back. We don't know really what dietary interventions can make a difference, and that might be more about studying those microbiomes and bacteria that are in us, which will be for a different time and place.
Right. I agree. Yes.
A lot of information. One thing you said, I don't know if it's just an anomaly, but
Sure.
in terms of the BMI.
Yeah.
There's the healthy 18 to 25, 20. But then you mentioned a BMI of 32 to 34 actually showed improvement. Am I misheard that?
So from BMIs of 22 to 32, it showed a decreased risk.
Right.
Technically, obesity overweight is categorized from BMIs of 25 to 30, or 29, you can say. And then obesity is categorized from 30 and on.
Right.
And there's different classes within that. But The overweight category from 25 to 32 showed the reduced risk,
Right.
but then it went back up for BMIs of 33 and on.
Okay. I misread that there's one area where it's good to be fat, you know, if you, it didn't make sense, so.
I also think that the issue with some of these studies is that BMI is such a crude way to measure adiposity, right? Like the fat in body composition. You're not delineating between body fat and lean muscle mass. Someone can be very lean, right, and have very little body fat and still be at a BMI of overweight, but it doesn't differentiate between that, right? So I'm interested to see if studies actually kind of delineate that for body fat and that risk for increased risk for melanoma versus just BMI, right?
Yeah. And the other thing was about vitamin C.
Sure.
Don't drink orange juice, basically.
So higher intakes, which is more than 1.6 times a day, was found to have higher risk for developing melanoma in vitro studies, right? So not technically human data, but I will say that could be, you know, like eating a grapefruit and a half a day or drinking a 4-ounce glass, 6-ounce glass of orange juice a day, right? Which a lot of people do. Yeah. The study is in vitro, so you can't really separate the sun exposure, right? It could be that those psoralins in vitamin C are sensitizing the skin, and without sun protection, you get that increased risk, right? It's similar to like skin care, like topical vitamin C and retinol. I'm not a dermatologist, but just in terms of using products without sun protection and sunscreen, those products can actually cause more damage. Using just vitamin C or retinol alone without sun protection can cause more damage, right? So maybe there's a correlation that way between topical and ingestion. Yes?
What about blueberries and raspberries?
Yeah, blueberries and raspberries are sources of polyphenols and antioxidants as well. They have a little bit of vitamin C in there, but it's mostly like those anthocyanins. Pretty much like those polyphenols, as you can see with I don't know if blueberries were on that chart, but higher consumption of those polyphenols usually have a protective effect against overall cancer. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Is there any way yet on GLP-1 drugs and reducing cancer risk?
I haven't delved into that research yet. Yeah. The one thing I will say is that, they're reducing your weight, right? A lot of the times by having an effect on that digestion. So a lower weight could promote lower risk of certain cancers, but specifically the GLP-1 acting on the cancer, I'm not quite sure.
No, just the weight.
Yeah.
If you reduce your weight by that method.
Right. Thank you, guys.
We're becoming more and more behind, but I think the talks are great and the question and answers are fantastic too. So forget about what it says on that piece of paper you have. It's, like don't listen to what the man behind the curtain says. In The Wizard of Oz. So our next speaker is going to be Dr. Hans Schoellhammer, who's a friend from City of Hope, surgical oncologist, mostly at the Santa Clarita Valley sites, and he's going to talk about surgery for small volume metastatic melanoma, when and if to perform. Thank you, Hans, for coming down.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. Thank you very much for having me. I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Essner and to Dr. Margolin for inviting me. Also, thank you to Melanoma Research Foundation and to St. John's as well, Borstein Family Foundation. So thank you very much. I am a surgical oncologist. I'm a cancer surgeon with specialty in melanoma. And I was asked to talk today about surgery for small volume metastatic melanoma, like when to do it, can we do it, when should it be done? So again, just a title slide to introduce our topic. No disclosures, nothing to discuss. Wanted to briefly talk about just the statistics of melanoma. It seems like everybody opens their talk with like talking about just how important and how big of a public health problem melanoma is. Briefly talking about surgery for early stage melanoma, and we know that surgery is one of the cornerstones for early stage melanoma. But then talking about how is surgery incorporated for patients with melanoma that has spread to other parts of the body. We know that, as we hear over and over again, melanoma is the most deadly skin cancer. About 100,000 new cases last year, a little less than 10,000 deaths. And in situ melanoma, superficial, just in the epidermis melanoma, makes up about another 100,000 of these cases as well. We know that this is a disease that does have the highest lifetime incidence in men and second highest in females. So once again, a huge public health problem, one that can really touch all of us. This is just data from cancer statistics from last year showing that in males, melanoma, fifth most common cancer, and then same in females as well. As Dr. Batra, our dermatologist, said, in general, skin cancers as a whole are actually the most common malignancy, but then in females, breast, and in males, prostate, highest incidence. In general, some risk factors for melanoma, we've talked about this during the day as well, but being male, older, tendency to sunburn or having sun-sensitive skin certainly is a risk factor. History of multiple blistering sunburns, especially earlier in life, having had non-melanoma skin cancers, these are all certainly risk factors for melanoma. Patients that are immunosuppressed for various reasons, for example, transplantation, blood cancers, having previous melanoma is a risk factor. Certainly we know that tanning bed use is certainly a risk factor, or even intermittent but intense sun exposure is a risk factor. Less than 2% of melanomas are directly attributable to a familial genetic issue, but patients with, for example, BRCA or BRCA2 mutation, there is increased risk for melanoma. A couple of other genes called CDKN2A, we're going to hear about a genetics talk as well, but these are risk factors, although they're kind of the less common risk factors directly for melanoma. Having increased nevi on the skin certainly is a risk factor as well. People that have, for example, increased amounts of moles compared with those that don't have any, that certainly is a risk factor, and a very important reason to be checked by dermatology, especially if you have, or if one has a lot of moles. Again, briefly, just to talk about a public health problem, tanning bed use. Certainly this increases the risk greatly of not just melanoma, but any skin cancer. These statistics this is about 10 years ago, but showing that perhaps even like over 6,000 melanomas may be attributed to tanning bed use. And using tanning beds before age 35, younger in life, massively increases risk. So certainly I think there's been many public health calls to decrease tanning bed use, and certainly for anybody that's a minor. I know Dr. Batra said kind of de-glamorizing tanning bed use. I think that this is very important. In general, looking at all patients with melanoma, the vast majority do present with early stage disease, stage 1 or 2. So these are melanomas that are just on the skin but have not moved to the nearby lymph nodes or to other organs. Just a little under 10% at the time that the melanoma is found. It will be in the nearby lymph nodes as well. And about 4% at the time that it's found, it will have spread to other parts of the body. So fortunately, most melanoma is early stage and potentially treatable and potentially curable. This is a time of great, I think we can say, hope for patients with melanoma. survival rates have been significantly going up. And for patients with metastatic melanoma, melanoma that's spread to other parts of the body, this is a time of increased survival as well. So for example, rough statistics back in 2009, 5-year survival for somebody with metastatic melanoma, it's already spread to other parts of the body. We can say the probability of being alive in 5 years with that condition, 18%. Even into 2015, though, already starting to see huge increases in the ability to survive with metastatic melanoma. And most of these are due to improvements in systemic therapies, in medications such as immunotherapy or other targeted medications that help people with metastatic melanoma to live longer. I think we saw a slide that's kind of similar to this previously, but just what to look for on the skin that is suspicious for melanoma. Typically the ABCDE mnemonic is used: asymmetry, border, colors, odd colors, even red or blue, something growing on the skin. D for the diameter, something that's growing bigger than, for example, a pencil eraser. Or E for evolution, something growing or changing. These features don't tell us that something's a melanoma, but certainly these are the things that would prompt a visit to dermatology to get something that's having these features biopsied and checked out. Really briefly, just talking about biopsy techniques, many different ways to biopsy the skin. Your dermatologist, will be able to go over this with you. The best way actually to diagnose a melanoma is to just narrowly take the whole thing out. That way the entire thing can be evaluated and it gives you a diagnosis. But even a punch biopsy, taking a whole punch of the skin, or even a shave that takes just a small part of it, anything that in general allows one to have the diagnosis to show that there is a melanoma there or some other form of skin cancer is beneficial. So, when in doubt, and typically this is the dermatologist, but having a biopsy done to prove what's going on. In general, the treatment for early stage melanoma, where it's just localized to the skin, is surgery to widely remove it. And then for melanomas that are certainly a millimeter deep into the skin, we recommend also a lymph node procedure at the same time, removing the first nearby lymph nodes. We call those the sentinel lymph nodes, to see microscopically has there been any spread of melanoma to the nearby lymph nodes. Melanomas that are even thinner than a millimeter, if they have potentially other suspicious features or things that look biologically like aggressive underneath the microscope, we may also discuss and offer having the lymph node procedure done at the time of the wide excision. But certainly any melanoma that's at least a millimeter deep into the skin, we discuss with the patient and offer having the lymph node portion of the procedure done at the time of surgery. Melanoma removals, unfortunately, we know that melanoma needs to be widely removed to decrease the risk of it recurring and to completely remove all of the tissue that's near it. These are currently the margins, how wide we go for a melanoma. These are our National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines. In general, the deeper the melanoma, the more widely it needs to be removed. Some of these distances are changed depending on what part of the body the melanoma is located on. But in general, melanoma surgeries can be, quite wide removals. We literally call it a wide local excision. And these distances have been borne out based on many decades of science and trials and research. How wide does a melanoma need to be removed? And this is just kind of like a pictorial of, for example, if one needs to take 2 centimeters all around a very thick melanoma, we may turn the incision into something that looks more like an ellipse or a football. So commonly the incisions may be even quite longer than the small pigmented dark thing that was on the skin originally. This is how we also have everything closed up neatly. I think what is probably the most exciting thing in melanoma care, even though I'm a surgeon, is systemic therapy. And we're in a time of huge advances and I think huge hope for patients with melanoma. Looking at this article from 2021, you can see from 1970 to even the early 2010s, there really wasn't much medication that worked well for melanoma. There's a super old chemotherapy called dacarbazine, which doesn't work that well. There's medication called interferon. There's a form of treatment called high-dose IL-2. IL-2 is a cytokine trying to stimulate your immune system to attack melanoma. That treatment was also very, very toxic. But for decades and decades, there really was nothing that worked medically all that well for melanoma. But in the early 2000s and then into the 2010s, we have this huge explosion of immunotherapy and other targeted therapies for melanoma. Melanoma is kind of we can say the poster child for immunotherapy. Going back to the slide from the Melanoma Research Foundation, we see that all of these initial immunotherapy medications that were initially used for melanoma have now been translated to many, many other malignancies. And so this is a time of great hope for melanoma, in part because of advancements in medical therapy. This is quite a busy slide, but we can see that essentially as time goes on with improved medical therapies, there's increased survival and increased promise for patients with melanoma, which even in like the late 1990s, early 2000s, may not have been the case. So metastasectomy, removing metastasis surgically, there definitely is a role for metastasectomy for patients with melanoma. In general, for patients where there's been spread, we want to make sure we have a biopsy of it. The biopsy allows certain molecular testing and genetic testing of the melanoma to be performed. These patients certainly need to be carefully what we call staged, so very thorough pictures of their body, typically with PET CTs and brain MRIs. We want to have pictures of the entire patient to know what disease is where, obviously up-to-date laboratory data and blood testing. And also, again, what we call next-generation sequencing, so checking all of the genetics of the melanoma. These are all very important for patients to be very thoroughly evaluated. Even older papers, though, and this is now going back to even the pre-immunotherapy era. This is kind of a compilation of many studies that have looked at metastasectomy, removing melanoma metastasis, and we can see that Dr. Essner has contributed to some of these papers in the past. There is a certain percentage of patients that had significant 5-year survival who have stage 4 disease, where the disease has spread to other parts of the body, that had significant survival with just surgery alone. And so some of this is even predating the era of modern immunotherapy and targeted therapy. M1A disease, this refers to melanoma that is spread to other parts of the skin or other lymph nodes. We can see that with just surgery alone, removing melanoma, there is a proportion of patients that had significant survival, even up to 5 years. M1B melanoma, this refers to a stage of melanoma where it's now spread into the lungs. But once again, and all of this is kind of pre-immunotherapy, one can see that there is a role for surgery for patients where if the melanoma metastasis has been able to be physically removed, there are a proportion of patients that can have significant survival. So how now in our modern era do we properly select patients, more accurately for who's going to benefit from surgery to remove melanoma that's spread? And just to be super clear, not all patients with stage 4 melanoma are candidates for surgery as one of the components of the treatment. In general, all of these patients really should have medical treatments first, either immunotherapy or some of the other what are called targeted therapies. And in part, it's how the patients respond to treating the entire body that then helps delineate, who may benefit from adding surgery as part of their treatment plan. I like to show this kind of retrospective study. So this is from Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. And this is retrospective, again, them looking back at their previous experience. But this was over 200 patients. with either advanced stage 3 melanoma or stage 4 disease who later had surgery. And in general, they looked at this group of patients. They kind of divided them into 3 groups. Patients where multiple parts of the body, the melanoma was just growing or progressing. A group of patients where there was just an isolated or responding lesion. And they kind of used this in part. All of these patients were treated with immunotherapy to see who could benefit. This is quite a busy slide, again, showing survival curves. We talked about that earlier. But in general, we can say that in this group of patients, those that responded to immunotherapy and had a responding or a stable lesion, or even just kind of one single lesion, and then that lesion was able to be removed, those patients derived significant survival benefit. We see the curves becoming flat, just staying stable, not decreasing or dropping. And so groups of patients with those features potentially can derive significant benefit from surgery to remove the melanoma. We see, unfortunately, patients that are just progressing. Those patients didn't really derive a benefit from surgery. We see those curves just continue to go down. Those are patients that are passing away. Patients that had disease that was removed but not completely, those patients also potentially did worse as well. So I think that we can say that patients that have a good response to medical treatment, where the disease responds and is shrinking, or, for example, if there's just one single site that's not responding and everything else is under control, and also disease where surgically we can remove it completely and not leave something behind, these is a group of patients that can derive the most benefit from metastasectomy. So surgery can be an important component of treatment for stage 4 disease. Again, to be very clear, not all patients with disease that spread to other parts of the body are candidates for surgery, or surgery may not be helpful for all patients where it's spread. But if there's low volume disease that can be removed surgically, and disease that is otherwise under control with medical treatments, they may derive the most benefit. Conversely, disease that's progressing or in multiple parts of the body, trying to surgically remove that then is less likely to derive benefit. So a big important part of helping to discern this is just discussing carefully at what we call our multidisciplinary tumor boards. All institutions do this. At City of Hope, we meet every other week to discuss our complex skin cancer patients in a big group to think about what's the most optimal treatment and how to sequence the treatments for patients. Really briefly, just to talk about another role for surgery with melanoma that is metastatic, and my colleague Dr. Xing is going to talk about this in a moment as well, but something called tumor infiltrating lymphocyte therapy, giving patients back their own immune system as a form of trying to treat melanoma, is now an FDA-approved treatment for melanoma that has at least failed having immunotherapy or some form of treatment first. And so surgery also does play a role for removing potentially tumor deposits to allow then the immune cells that are on the inside to be harvested and generated and later given back to the patient. This treatment is called lifileucel. It's a one-time infusion of essentially the patient's own immune cells that have been isolated from tumor. We know that our immune system does infiltrate into melanoma tumors. There are immune cells that are in the tumor, and potentially are these immune system cells, these lymphocytes, able to be trained to attack melanoma. In general, these patients are first treated with chemotherapy to partly wipe out their immune system. What we call the TILs, your own immune system cells, have been grown in a lab over about a 3-week period, and later they're given back to the patient. This is yet another example of something that is first-in-class FDA approved for melanoma. Melanoma has been kind of the poster child for many first-in-class FDA treatments. For example, oncolytic viruses that can be injected that can try to destroy melanoma. First-in-class is also FDA approved in melanoma as well. This is just a kind of a pictorial of this, what we call TIL treatment. And again, I kind of bring it up to show that surgery does play a role. The tumor does need to be physically removed. The TILs are grown in a lab. Patients later come back for chemotherapy to partly deplete their immune system. And then the TILs are given back to the patient along with that cytokine IL-2, which helps to then stimulate the immune system. Just kind of some data, this is a bit more scientific now, on kind of the trial that led to this medication or this treatment, Livalucil, being approved. This is called the C144 trial. A small amount of patients, 66 of them, and these are all patients that had actually, in general, the average number of patients had 3 different types of melanoma treatments that had failed previously. So this is something for patients with very, very advanced disease. This is not the first thing we would do. But in this trial, in general, 80% of the disease was controlled. A little over a third of the patients had response. And even half of those that were responding then had some degree of durable response, meaning, at least continued response up to about 18 months later. This is a very small group of patients with very, very serious disease, but this is yet another option for treatment. Surgery does play a role in literally getting part of the tumor out so that the immune system can be harvested. These are just more, again, survival curves of treatment with this medication regime called Livalucil. So I think that we can say in general right now actually is a huge time of great progress and hope for patients with melanoma. Most patients with melanoma present early, where the melanoma can be removed. A certain proportion of patients, unfortunately, will have it come back. And those patients, if it's spread, need to be carefully considered, treated with medical treatments, but then surgery and other treatments, such as radiation or injecting oncolytic virus or giving somebody's own immune system back to them, can be parts of the treatment. So right now is a time of great hope that, looking back over the previous years, 1970s, 80s, 90s, where there really was less good medical treatments, this is a time of really great hope. In general, though, we say that prevention is key. Our dermatologist, Dr. Batra, gave a great talk, but basically protecting children from the sun, avoiding harmful chemicals, checking your skin regularly, don't smoke. We just heard about a dietary component to help decrease risk of melanoma as well. Certainly no tanning beds. Daily sunscreen, at least SPF 30, it appears, where most of the benefit starts, and just protecting one's skin from further damage. And don't forget to also just keep an eye on your skin. I think the Melanoma Research Foundation has a slide about, get naked, check your skin. It is important to keep an eye on all the spots of your skin as best as possible, something that's growing or changing, seeing dermatology or getting that checked. I see patients in our City of Hope system. We have an office in Mission Hills, which is the San Fernando Valley. I also see patients way further north in the Antelope Valley. If there are ever any questions, please reach out, and happy to take any questions now or moving on with the program. So thank you very much. Yes, please.
Definition uses small volume can mean the size or the number. You're speaking particularly of the number. It has nothing to do with the size. It's not like you wouldn't do a large melanoma. Am I correct that you're referring to when you say small volume? What's small? Two or 3 or 4? Or how do you determine that?
Sure. Yeah. So the question is like, what is small for those online? What is small volume? What can be removed? I think in general, I would say that it refers to both the number and the size. If there's quite a number of lesions, we're talking about metastatic melanoma, but they can be removed all surgically completely without causing some huge morbidity, some harm to the patient. That's doable. These are kind of more uncommon scenarios, but even a very large tumor, if there's just one, but the patient's doing well on their medical treatments, and it can be removed completely without causing undue morbidity, harm, then that's doable as well. So a lot of careful kind of decision-making goes into this. We do this at our tumor board. All institutions probably have tumor boards.
We also have a question online. Is age a factor in who is a good candidate for surgical intervention?
So I think in general, age just by itself does not necessarily impact who is a good candidate. Literally yesterday, I had a patient that was 91, successfully removed his melanoma. My oldest melanoma patient that I've treated surgically was 95. In general, it's the other medical problems that go along with age, though. So, for example, heart disease, brain dysfunction, kidney and liver dysfunction. So age just by itself, not necessarily a reason to not do surgery. It's the other medical problems that go along with it. So age just by itself, purely a number. So we got to carefully consider the whole patient. So thank you very much. Thank you.
So it's probably not an accident that City of Hope and former City of Hope people are pretty well represented in this group. So the next is Dr. Xing, who is a medical oncologist and fully in charge of the TIL cell program. You know now what TIL cells are, tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes, in case you weren't listening to Dr. Schoellhammer. And it takes a very large village to do this therapy, and Dr. Xing is going to tell you all about it.
Hi, good morning. I'm Xing, and thank you for having me here. Today I'm going to discuss the cellular therapy for melanoma. I don't have any disclosures. So this is similar like Dr. Schoellhammer's slides, showing all the FDA-approved therapy for advanced melanoma. And here you can see before 2011, we barely have anything for melanoma. But after that, we have advanced both in immunotherapy and targeted therapy. So the top portion with the blue color showing all the immunotherapy approved for the melanoma. And here you can see the Nivo EP and the Nivo Rather are now usually used as a first-line treatment for stage 4 melanoma. And on the bottom part is coded as orange color. Those are the target therapy for BRAF mutation, which described by Dr. Essner earlier before. So we have two main treatment right now, immunotherapy and targeted therapy for melanoma. And this did help advance or prolong our survival to about 50%. And today I'm going to focus on the most recently approval for the second line or third line for the BRAF mutated melanoma, which is lifileucel, is also called TIL therapy. This was approved last year in February. And here I want to discuss what's cellular therapy. So basically we're using our own body, our own T cells. It's our soldiers to fight against the cancer. These T cells are special immune cells that are supposed to find and destroy the invaders, including the cancer cells. And TILs are the T cells called tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes, have already found the tumor and enter into the tumor site to try and fight against the cancer. And then we do have FDA approval for this TIL therapy. It's called Amtagvi. It's a living drug. It's different from the previous Uvoy Opdualag because it's made by your own T cells. It's a one-time TIL therapy made from the T cells and they were found inside the tumor. This is the journey for the TIL therapy. The step one is manufacturing. First step is the tumor surgery. Actually, Dr. Schoellhammer already helped us harvest several patients' tissue to make the TILs. Like he or other surgeons removed small piece of the tumor and can often be outpatient procedure, and the tissue contains the TILs. But the TILs from the tissue, the tumor is very small quantity, so it need to be sent to the lab to make more big quantity and try to clean or rejuvenate it, and then to make enough number to fight against the cancer. This, the actual processing day is about 22 days from the previous slide shown from Dr. Schoellhammer's slides, but sometimes they need more, about 7 to 10 days for quality control. So usually we expect the cells will come back to us about in 5 weeks from the surgery date. And then after it's delivered, and then we going to infuse this personalized one-time Amtavi treatment to from the Iovance company, and they shipped it as a frozen and shipped back to our hospital, and we're planning for the admission, which is the next step. So this is actually need to be stayed in the hospital to receive the treatment because it's very, I would say, very toxic from the beginning. It will start with the chemotherapy for a week. This is not to treat cancer. Actually, we try to use this treatment to make the room for the T cells. And then the day A will be the actual infusing the T cells back into the body. It usually takes less than 90 minutes. And after that, for the next 3 days, we're going to receive, get the IL-2, which is a cytokine to help the T cells to grow and work inside the tumor. What's the safety and the side effects for this treatment? This treatment does have serious risk, including the chemo going to cause the low blood counts, serious infection, and heart and lung or kidney problems. And the care team will monitor the patient very closely in the hospital. The common side effects are from the chemotherapy and the IL-2, including the fever, chills, fatigue, low blood counts, low blood pressure, and the fast heart rate. The side effect timing, in the main study from the trial, the incidence of these side effects decreased rapidly within 2 weeks after the infusion. And the long-term safety found the new or late onset side effects were not related to the Amtavi cells themselves. So this is the data from the trial. The left side shows the most common side effects, and you can see thrombocytopenia, that means you have low platelets, is the most common side effects on the top. And chills, anemia, and fever, neutropenia, all these are common side effects from the chemo. And they did have a treatment-related mortality rate about 7.5% from the trial. And the right side panel showing the incidence of the side effects from the trial, and then you can see the day 14 is showing most of them happen within the 2 weeks. And after first month, the side effects is much less, especially for the higher, the severe side effects coded as the purple and the yellow color. Most of them after 1 month is more benign side effects. How well does it work? So Dr. Schoellhammer also mentioned the ORR is objective response rate is about 31%. And then the tumor shrinkage or disappear, that can be counted as this part, 1/3 of patient. And they did have a durable response as well. So we do have a long-term benefit from this trial. This is just presented this year, our national meeting, and you can see even as a second-line or third-line treatment for advanced melanoma, we can still achieve the 5-year overall survival about 20%. And the median overall survival was about 14 months. So the question now is, if you are a melanoma patient or a stage 4 melanoma patient, is Amtavi right for you? The eligibility criteria includes the first, the patient should have stage 4 or advanced melanoma cannot be removed by surgery. And also the patient has been treated by immunotherapy, or if they have BRAF mutation, they should have a BRAF inhibitors already. So basically the eligibility depends on the full treatment history and need to be fully discussed with the healthcare team. So the future of the TIL therapy, we'll try to make this treatment better. One thing is try to treating earlier. So now we have a clinical trial combining the Keytruda together to make it as a first-line treatment. So basically the patient can receive as the first treatment when they have stage 4 disease. The second thing is we want to make the treatment safer. We know there's a lot of toxicity coming from the IL-2. So the new next generation TIL are being developed. Some are engineered to make their own IL-15, which is a growth factor for the TIL. That way we can try to remove the need for the high dose IL-2 and the side effects associated with it. And then for this, you need to find a treatment center. Iovance has maybe more than 50 authorized centers across the country now. We are one of them. And when you think about TIL therapy, you need to plan for the caregiver support, because during the first months of the TIL, we want the patient to stay close to the hospital to manage the side effects as soon as possible. So that would be saying you have to 24/7 care and from your family or friends to monitor you when you are not discharged for the hospital. And then Iovance also have a great program to provide support to patients, including information on the financial assistance. Here are just some clinical trials we have at City Hope in terms of a cellular therapy setting. So the first one is the one I mentioned. We try to treat patient earlier with first line combining with the Keytruda. And the second line is the CAR T-cell therapy to use IL-13 receptor alpha CAR T-cells to treat cancer. And then the third one is the engineered T-cell receptor therapy to help with the patient to fight against cancer. So here I will just briefly explain the difference between the TIL and the CAR T-cell therapy. So for TIL, we know we need to get the T-cells from the tissue, from the tumor. But for CAR T, is just no need for surgery, just do the blood draw, we call leukapheresis, to get the T-cells from your own blood. And in terms of modification, so for TIL, we don't do any modification. We try to grow more of your own TILs. And the CAR T, they do need to do genetically engineering to, with a new receptor to be able to recognize the tumor cells. And for the target, TIL aim to recognize many targets from the cancer cells, so we call polyclonal. But for the CAR T, since they have a receptor associated, the way to attack the cancer, so it's monoclonal. It can only engineer to find one specific target. And the status in terms of FDA approval, so TIL therapy, Amtagvi, is approved by FDA, so it can be available anytime in our centers. But for this CAR T therapy, it's only available as in clinical trial setting. So the question for the doctor, your oncologist, am I a good candidate for Amtagvi? And what are the nearest center for this treatment? And what are the practical challenges we should plan for? And what's your center's experience with this treatment? Yeah, sorry. I'm happy to take any questions regarding this. Thank you. Yeah, please, sir.
You mentioned that the median survival is 14 months. What is the survival without the treatment?
Oh, that will be hard to say. I think this is not a randomized trial. So this would be likely less than 14 months.
Okay, it looks like we've got pretty much of a decent quorum here. We have all our question askers, and future members of the patient panel I know are here, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. I'm a medical oncologist at St. John's, work closely with Dr. Essner, used to be at City of Hope, and so I know many of my former colleagues are here, and I'm going to tell you about vaccine strategies for melanoma. I must warn you that I went over my talk quickly, and I think it's a bit on the technical side, so I'm going to try to explain everything as well as I can, and I'm happy to take questions or explain more later or let you pour over my slides if you wish to. So on that note, let's take a ride. So just by way of a brief history of tumor vaccines in melanoma, and I'll just put in a plug that the center where we currently work, St. John's Cancer Institute, until relatively recently was called the John Wayne Cancer Institute. And the John Wayne is where Donald Morton and many of his colleagues and trainees, mentees, were extremely active over several decades until about a decade or a decade and a half ago in the field of tumor vaccines. And most of the tumor vaccines have been directed at treating the disease rather than preventing the disease. If we make progress in treating, then we generally move backwards towards prevention, but the many of the concepts and logistics are actually quite different. So that's why I put on the top line that you should be aware that vaccine therapy is not the same as immunization and prevention, therapy being treatment for a disease that's already established. So the initial vaccines, both in this institute as well as in several others, including in other countries, were based on whole cancer cells. Generally, they were treated with radiation or chemicals to make sure they couldn't replicate in the cancer patient, although often, most of the time, they were actually from other they were mainly from cell lines or other individuals they were incapable of taking as a graft. But in the end, they were ineffective, and there were a million reasons why, which we won't go through, although they will become more apparent as we go through. Part of that strategy was to create sort of a local inflammation with local chemical treatments and even viruses. And bacteria such as BCG, which I'm sure many of you have heard of because it was the part of the backbone of some of those vaccines that were under development at our center. In fact, there's a few patients who still wander into clinic and they have these scars over the lymph nodes where the BCG was injected back in the day. The current day approaches include those things that you see at the bottom, which include something called toll receptor agonists. There are cells in our body, so you think of the immune system as being based on the white blood cells in our body, and the white blood cells comprise quite a few different cell types. I don't think I have a diagram of that, but the most important cell type that helps our immune system and the T cells, which you saw earlier with Dr. Xing's talk, we very much need cells that take the material from, say, bacterial infections, fungal infections, and in this case, cancer cells, and they take them up into their cells, they break them down, they break down the antigens, and they sort of prepare them as you might prepare a meal, where you cut things up and then you put them together and you cook them and then you put them on a beautiful plate. So they're called antigen-presenting cells, and we also know them as dendritic cells. And those cells are really key, and they have all these substances inside them or on their surface that receive signals from the outside world or from the inside world, and thus some of them are called the toll receptors. You can think of it as a toll gate, although I don't think it comes from the same origin. An agonist just means a substance that turns on the receptor or turns on the pathway, as opposed to an antagonist, which is something that inhibits or blocks the pathway. So you got toll receptor agonists, you've got cytokines, which are signaling molecules, many of which are also called interleukins, and you heard about interleukin-2, and there's many other interleukins. There's a fancy term called oncolytic virotherapy, which is where you have viruses that have also been essentially deviralized or have been neutralized so they don't cause viral illnesses, but you can put genes into the DNA or RNA of certain viruses, and those viruses might stick to cancer cells and even enter the cancer cells and cause those cells to produce pieces of the viruses that can be very immunogenic and tell the immune system to attack the tumors that carry those viral elements, and even to become active against other antigens that may be on the tumor. And then finally, radiation can cause changes in cancer cells that can make them more likely to be seen by the immune system, and together with other manipulations may make them more effective immunotherapy. The latest and greatest of the vaccines are known as the mRNA vaccines. Most of you have heard of those, or maybe all of you, because of course, of the incredibly rapid progress that was made early in the COVID pandemic, where efforts that were ongoing to make other kinds of vaccines were quickly turned to the strategies for making COVID vaccines, and those were highly, highly effective, no matter what anyone in politics tells you otherwise. Public antigens are the ones that are on many different we'll just be talking about cancer cells now. And so those public antigens may be pretty specific to tumor, but they're not specific to the patient. And they would be the ideal thing to use for vaccinations if they were very specific to tumor and were seen in all patients who had that tumor, because then you could make the same kind of vaccines that you make for COVID and other viral illnesses. But to date, they haven't really proven to be that effective. There are not that many of them, and I believe that resistance or tolerance develops pretty quickly. The most popular now is the so-called private or patient-specific antigens, which are based on mutations that are unique to the particular patient that probably came from all that sun dam. In the case of melanoma, for most patients with melanoma, they somehow originated from all that sun damage that you heard about from Dr. Batra and others. And so, you know, with the newest techniques that we have for sequencing the DNA and even the RNA that are present in tumors, and that basically create the template for everything that the cancer cell and non-cancer cells do, they're like roadmaps. We have these tumor-specific mutation-derived proteins and pieces of proteins that can be considered to be seen by the immune system and may be the basis for highly effective vaccine therapies. So the data are very promising. We have a very, you'll see a graph in a couple of minutes of a very promising vaccine that was used in a setting that's kind of part way between what I mentioned earlier about prevention and treatment, and that's the adjuvant setting. We haven't really talked about that here, but the adjuvant setting, as many of you yourselves know, is that setting where a melanoma has been removed, maybe just the deep melanoma or thick melanoma, or maybe the melanoma plus some lymph nodes that had melanoma in them. Those situations put you at high risk of relapse, and so the adjuvant setting is where we want to come in with interventions. We know that the patient already has the tumor, but it's been removed, but there may be microscopic little groups, clusters of tumor cells or individual tumor cells that are capable of starting a new metastasis, and that's the place where we want the immune system to really get rid of those tiny little incipient new tumors. I'm jumping very quickly to an effective oncolytic virotherapy based sort of a vaccine. The RP1 is a sort of a derivative of a herpes simplex virus. Simplex causes cold sores and causes genital herpes infections. Once the body has them, it will always have them. That is not the active infections, but the virus. And so we often can make strong immune responses against the virus and against something that the virus has been engineered to carry. And so some of these, what they're engineered to carry in this case is another immunogenic molecule called GM-CSF. It stimulates cells of the immune system. And if you look, I'm sorry, this is a busy slide. It's got a lot of information, and I stole it directly from a slide set from presentations of this virus that were even presented to the FDA recently and are going back to the FDA soon to see if we can convince those people to approve this virus, which looks like it's even better than TVEC. Some of you may have had TVEC. But at the very bottom of each of these columns, I think this might be a light, maybe not. But look at the yellow ones, and you'll see that the average ORR stands for objective response rate. So this is in people who have active tumor. We moved away now from the adjuvant setting. At the bottom, for all patients, around a 33% response rate, 26% if you look at one of the subsets, 35% you look at another subset. So across the board, it's in that range of 33%. This is a virus that is designed to be given by direct injection into the tumor. It's given with nivolumab, otherwise known as Opdivo, to help to activate those cells as well. And although it hasn't been compared with the virus alone, it has been compared with Opdivo alone and looks better. And I should say it looks like it's going to look better because that will be the definitive trial that goes to the FDA soon. The most exciting things about these viruses are, number one, that they're really easy to inject. I've done a lot of TVEC injections. Dr. Essner, I'm sure Dr. Xing and Dr. Schoellhammer have as well. And if we can't get to the tumor, we can ask a radiologist to find the tumor, usually by ultrasound, and to inject them directly. But what's most exciting is that you can get out of that injection enough sensitization of those T cells, they're probably tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes of some sort, that are right there in the tumor so that they become sensitized to tumor antigens. And then they can cause a response not only in the tumor that you've injected, but also they will travel through the body and they can cause remissions of tumors at a distance that you didn't or couldn't inject. So this is the durable responses. You've seen a lot of graphs now. You know how to look at these graphs. On the left side, you can't read it because it's so tiny, but it says probability of ongoing response. So you see that as you move your eyes out towards the right side, where there are many fewer patients, because this is far out from the time of injection, each tick mark, it represents an injection, and a patient, and each time the curve goes down, represents somebody who fell off the curve. In other words, they lost their response. So the numbers out towards the right are not very convincing because there are very few patients. But earlier on, you have more ticks. That means more patients. When we can say we've achieved a plateau, that means that nobody is falling off the curve anymore, that the patient is maintaining whatever it is we're looking for. Sometimes it's about ongoing response, or failure to relapse is really what the curve shows. Or in the right-sided curve, it's overall survival. So you start out where everyone's alive, so that's 100% or 1 on the curve, and then you go down over time. And that plateau is looking pretty good at about 55% with where we are, and the median overall survival has not been reached because we're still over 50% of the patients are still alive. So it looks very promising, and please stay tuned. I'm going to skip this slide. These are what so-called spider plots that show, you'll take my word for it unless you really want to pore over those, but basically what they show is that you're seeing the same decrease over time in the size of the injected lesions as well as the non-injected lesions. Some people have called this an abscopal. It comes from some Greek word that means at a distance, I believe, or at the end. And so this principle that the T cells are seeing antigens just because you injected the tumor with virus and a stimulatory agent, that's really quite exciting. I'm not going to go through these genes and T cell clones. I don't know why I even left them in this slide set. Okay, so now let's move on to the current day, a little bit more precise and well-defined kind of vaccine. It's called V940. It's mRNA 4157. Doesn't have a name yet. Again, brought to you by the people who have brought to you the highly effective COVID vaccines. And so a neoantigen, I think you may have seen already what neoantigen means, but at the risk of repeating and boring you. So a neoantigen, neo means new. And so new antigens are created when ultraviolet light that you heard about earlier strikes the DNA of the cell, of a normal cell, and causes it to be mutated. And then those mutations are carried through with subsequent replications, and you take a benign or normal cell to become a malignant cell. And that's what's happening with melanoma, with a lot of help from nearby friends, including keratinocytes and other cells in the neighborhood. Neoantigens are those which are created by that sun damage to the DNA, and those give rise to the RNA, which is the roadmap that comes off the DNA, and then the protein, which is roadmapped by the RNA. So DNA, RNA, protein, just like some of you learned in high school and college. Hopefully the rest of you heard about it somehow. Again, a highly technical slide, but basically what happens is you can, the companies or the labs that produce this can find and make the RNA that encodes up to 34 of these neoantigens. That's just a practical number. And they can prepare it in such a way that it's given in little tiny globules of fat, which provides that stimulus to the dendritic cells that I talked about on the first slide, the antigen-presenting cells. And this system has everything it needs to create a highly effective immune response. And this is in people who already have growing tumor. They're not immunosuppressed per se, but they do have cancer, and they have a lack of adequate immune response against the cancer that would be sufficient to make the cancer stop growing. So when this was given in a so-called randomized phase 2 study, which for now I'm not going to go through how that's different than a highly statistically robust big randomized study that can get a drug approved, but basically the bottom line is it has fewer patients, and so the data are not quite as convincing, and it's more of an exploratory than a definitive. But as you can see here, if you run your eyes across these two curves, the bright red curve is and it's given with pembrolizumab or Keytruda that helps to stimulate those T cells, as you know, that is how it works. So the mRNA is represented by the red curve, and the pembrolizumab alone is represented by the dark charcoal-covered curve. And as you can see, all along, except at the beginning, and I'll explain that in a second, the curves have separated. And again, at the very right side, even though it looks like the curves came together, there are so few patients on that end of this kind of a curve, it's called a Kaplan-Meier curve, that we really don't make much of that. We can get very excited about what's happening in the middle of the curve, and if that continues out and pushes the place where the two curves come together way further to the right, we'll end up with curves that are highly statistically significant. And in fact, if it were considered legitimate or kosher, whatever word you like, to compare two curves with such a small number of patients, 150, that p-value you see at the very right in the blue rectangle at the bottom, p equals 0.0266. When we do studies, that would be considered highly significant difference between the two curves, but because of the statistical design of the study, it doesn't quite count yet. However, there is a study ongoing that's accrued, I think, most, if not all of its patients. Do you happen to know if it's all accrued by now? No? Okay. Anyway, a phase 3, which has far more patients, and the idea is it's going to hopefully validate these separation of these curves and get this mRNA to be approved as a therapeutic or adjuvant vaccine for high-risk melanoma. Which stages of high risk, I don't exactly know. You'll have to stay tuned for that. I promised you a word or two about the early parts of the curve and why they're not separate. I mean, you could say they're separate a little, but essentially they're not. And the reason for that is that immune responses take a little time to develop. And you can see that, well, on this one, it would suggest that it takes, 20 to 40 weeks. That sounds like a long time. That's half a year to almost a year. But in this case, we're just waiting for the curves to separate. There are patients relapsing at the beginning, and it takes time for that vaccine response to show its benefit when given with Pembro over the Pembro alone. Many, many curves are going to look like that in immunotherapy, and even some curves when we use those BRAF drugs that you heard about earlier for the BRAF mutated melanomas, you actually, when they're advanced melanomas, you actually see that the BRAF curve looks better than the immuno curve, even though at the end of the day, the immuno curves turn out to be better. But that's because at the beginning, those BRAF drugs work super, super well, and the immuno takes its time, and a few patients don't benefit that might have benefited if they had a mutation. So those are just quirks about how these drugs work when we give them to people. Just a few final words. There's a new study that came out in which a different kind of sort of individualized peptide vaccine came out that contains elements that stimulate a couple of different components of the immune system, and it's given with some stronger stimulants of those dendritic cells or antigen-presenting cells. One's called montanide, the other one's called poly-ICLC, and they're very, very potent stimulants. And the main purpose of this study, which only had 8 patients in it, but appeared in one of our major journals, was to study the immunologic outcomes that are resulting from these manipulations of the immune system. And the investigators who were at Harvard and the Dana-Farber did find very, very potent T-cell responses. It's a T lymphocyte that mediates all of these immune responses, CD8 cells, which are the killer cells, and they were against the majority of those neoantigens or epitopes, which are a little tiny piece of the antigen, and hundreds of different kinds of T-cell types that could respond to that form of vaccine, which are much greater than, if you see the greater than sign, if you put 2 of them in a row, that means much, much greater than those which could be achieved from nivolumab, that's also known as Opdivo alone. So stay tuned for more about that. We'll be hearing more. And it is now my pleasure to either answer 1 or 2 questions or to introduce our genetic counselor, Molly Frankle. And I hope I didn't stun you too much with too much technical in the way of slides. Yes?
I was just going to say, the decision of which...
The decision of which type of therapy to take, which vaccine, and that's something you discuss with your physician, your oncologist, and I mean, it's a huge decision.
Yeah, well, right now, this is not like the COVID vaccines where it's Pfizer or Moderna or whatever. These vaccines are going to be very slow in coming, and they're going to be for very specific groups of patients, and there's not going to be the kinds of choices that we see with the makers of the COVID vaccines. So that we'll have to put on the side. Even antihypertensives have choices, but these are not going to be quite so straightforward. Okay, thank you, Molly.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Molly Frankle. I'm a genetic counselor.
I do work at St. John's. I also see patients out of the Disney Cancer Center in Burbank. And I'm happy to be here to talk about hereditary causes of melanoma and hopefully answer any questions that you might have. Okay, so just the topics that I want to review today, just explaining what genetic testing is and talk about who might qualify to have it done, how we might use those results, and if you're interested or have family members who might be interested, how you might want to come in and see us in our clinic. So to get down to the basics of it, a lot of talk about DNA in general today. This is the very basic sort of high school textbook information about DNA. Your genes we kind of think of as instructions that tell your body how to work properly, and it's essentially just a computer code, a long string, 3 billion letters long. That's the same 4 letters repeating over and over again. When we're talking about doing genetic testing and these hereditary causes of cancer, we're talking generally about mutations in the DNA. So you can see the difference between that first strand and the second strand. There's 1 letter that's changed, essentially a typo. And that means that what should be a functional gene that, as I think Dr. Essner was describing, eventually is meant to create proteins in your body, becomes mutated, can no longer create a functional protein, or maybe doesn't create any kind of protein at all. This is kind of the very basic explanation for what a genetic mutation is and how it does actually cause problems within your body. As far as the process of genetic testing, it's pretty straightforward. We collect a sample, typically a blood sample. It can also be done with saliva or sometimes a cheek swab. Rarely we might take a skin sample for certain scenarios. That sample is sent to a laboratory, and then the DNA can be extracted from the cells that are in the sample, and then very complicated processes take place to read through the letters of the DNA to look for those genetic mutations. And essentially they're comparing your computer code to a reference sequence of how we expect your DNA to look. When we're talking specifically about melanoma and really about cancer in general, this has been alluded to already today, but the vast majority of cancer, and in particular melanoma, is what we call sporadic. So that's the big blue chunk of that pie. I think the number 93% was thrown out earlier. That's probably the same thing that we would say. Over 90% of melanoma caused by primarily sun exposure, but also other unknown environmental factors. And with cancer in general, what we tend to say is just the process of aging is the #1 risk factor for getting cancer. So I believe Ashley also alluded to this in talking about sort of oxidative stress on the body and how that can accumulate over time. And as we get older, for the most part, our risk for cancer tends to increase just because of the fact that our bodies have been exposed to so many things that can be cancer causing. What we focus on in genetics is the other 2 small pieces of the pie chart there. So we divide them up into a category that we call familial and a category that we call hereditary, which can kind of sound the same. The differentiation is that the hereditary category refers to families in which we can identify one of those individual genetic mutations that I talked about on a previous slide that's significantly increasing the risk for cancer in the family. It's being passed down through generations. The familial category is scenarios where we might see a family history of cancer that looks very suspicious. So maybe half of the members of the family have had cancer, and in particular, they've all had the same type of cancer. So in this case, maybe everyone in your family's had melanoma. But some of those families, we do this genetic testing, and we can't find one of those mutations. So importantly, there's a ton that we don't know about our DNA. It's very possible that there could be something genetic that we just don't understand. We also know that families have shared environmental exposures, in particular sun exposure. So maybe you spent summers outside with your family as a child and got those sunburns that Dr. Batra referred to. And so sometimes we see a cluster that might not be explained by something we can identify on a genetic test. The importance of that familial category, which we don't talk about as much, is that if you have a family history of a particular type of cancer in multiple people, even if you don't carry a mutation like this, we would probably still say that your chances of getting that cancer are higher than the average person, just because there's a lot of factors that we can't really understand. And we're doing more studies of what we call polygenic risk score testing to try to better understand families that fall into that category. But historically and still currently, our primary focus is on that hereditary category. The right side of the image here is the list of the most common, still very rare, but in the world of genetics, the common genetic causes of melanoma. A lot of people are probably familiar with the BRCA gene, so the BRCA2 gene does have an association with melanoma and ocular melanoma. And some of these other genes, much more rare, but do have associations with hereditary causes of melanoma as well. Okay, this is kind of a hard question to answer. There's a lot of criteria that can allow someone to qualify for genetic testing. Specific to melanoma, we tend to follow the guidelines of the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, or NCCN, and their recommendation is any individual who has had 3 or more invasive cutaneous melanomas, and in particular, if any of them was diagnosed at a young age, which in this case is considered under the age of 45. It's kind of a rule of 3 if you also have 3 or more members of the same family that have had melanoma. We can also see melanoma and pancreatic cancer clustering together in families as a result of mutations in a gene called CDKN2A. So if you have melanoma and a family history of pancreatic cancer, that can be an indication that there might be something genetic. And then some more rare circumstances, more than 50 atypical moles, along with a family history of melanoma, and then there are some very rare types of skin findings that your dermatologist might flag and refer you to genetics based on that. But as far as something that you could evaluate about your own family history, if you can look into your family and say, there are 3 people who have had melanoma, that would be something that we would recommend a genetics evaluation for. This is even harder to sort of summarize briefly. This is beyond melanoma who might consider genetic testing. Pancreatic and ovarian cancer are big indications, especially in the context of melanoma because both are associated with that BRCA2 gene that I mentioned before. I'm not going to review all of these things, but if any of these things apply to you or your family, you might qualify for a genetics evaluation. Including based on ancestry. If you have Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, some of these mutations are more common in different populations. That is one population where we can see a higher rate of that BRCA2 mutation. Okay, and then once you get genetic testing, what do we do with the information is kind of the next question. So the first thing that a genetic test can help us to do is explain someone's personal or family history of cancer. But beyond that, we want to use the information to be more proactive, essentially, about how that person is getting screened for cancer. Obviously, specific to melanoma, it would mean potentially more frequent visits to the dermatologist, potentially more thorough evaluations with our BRCA2 carriers. We recommend that they also have their eyes checked because of the risk for ocular melanoma. But then beyond melanoma, if you have melanoma in your personal or family history and it is caused by one of these genetic mutations, it could be possible there are other types of cancers that you might be predisposed to that we wouldn't have realized previously. So maybe it might mean more breast cancer screening if you are identified to have something, or screening for pancreatic cancer. There are all these new technologies coming out. We had sort of referenced the GRAIL or the Gallery test earlier, which hopefully as the years go by will become more and more available and more affordable, which can be options for people who fall into this category of having a higher risk for cancer. Early offerings like that can sometimes become available. And then very importantly for a lot of people, their primary motivation to have the testing done is just to share the information with their family, in particular their children. People who've had a personal history of cancer often want to better understand it so they know what they can tell their children. Their children can be tested, and if they have the same thing, they can sort of participate in more of these early screening options. But of course, there are a lot of limitations. I alluded before to that familial category. There are some families where we aren't going to be able to identify the specific genetic cause of what's going on. There are uncertain results. Anytime we do any kind of medical testing, there's a possibility of uncertainty, but in particular with genetic testing, just because of how little we know about some parts of our DNA, it's a high likelihood we might find something where we say, for now, we don't really know what this means, and there can sometimes be anxieties around that. And then, we're not diagnosing anyone with cancer. We're giving a sort of prediction of the likelihood of developing cancer. A lot of people have concerns about the psychology of it, the burden on their family, which is why, the counseling portion of a genetic counselor comes into play, that it's not always the right option for everyone, but, the benefits can sometimes outweigh that anxiety that comes along with it. We get a lot of questions about 23andMe type testing, ancestry testing. It's not the same as what we do. They use a different technology. They're looking more broadly, sort of zoomed out at your DNA and not as specifically for these individual genetic mutations. So if you've had a 23andMe test, we would still recommend, if you qualify, to do a medical grade test. Importantly, recently, maybe within the last 5 years or so, 23andMe started testing for BRCA1 and 2, but even they note on their website, and they claim to thoroughly educate their users, but there is still a lot of confusion. It's not comprehensive BRCA testing. So even if 23andMe told you you don't have a BRCA mutation, it doesn't mean you don't have a BRCA mutation. If you did get a positive result from 23andMe, even in that case, we do recommend a follow-up medical grade test to confirm that it is an accurate result. I think I just reviewed all that, but there are 1,000+ mutations in BRCA, and I think they look for maybe 30, some in that range, so it's very, very limited. Okay. And then a lot of people ask about cons of genetic testing. I mean, we talked about uncertainty and anxiety. One of the other things that comes up very frequently is concerns about privacy. There is a federal law called GINA, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. It was signed in 2008, so it's been around for a while. And it prohibits any discrimination from your employer, as long as it is greater than 15 employees in the company, and from your health insurance. So even if you are found to carry one of these types of gene mutations, a BRCA gene mutation, your insurance cannot say it's a pre-existing condition. You're protected from that level of discrimination. But it doesn't apply to other types of insurance, including life insurance and these other insurances listed here. It also doesn't apply to people who have insurance through the military. And they do ask, I actually just applied for life insurance policy, and they asked if I have a family history of various genetic mutations, so it could come up. We do just advise people who have concerns about this, if you have an insurance policy in place, they cannot discriminate based on new information. So if you want to have genetic testing done, we just say to kind of get everything squared away before going through the process. So here's the information for our clinic. We have offices sort of regionally. So at St. John, I primarily work at St. John's. We do have office in, we do have a genetic counselor who is in Torrance at Little Company of Mary, and then our primary location is in Burbank. Importantly, we do have what we call our walk-in clinic, which is available to any person who has a personal history or a recent diagnosis of cancer, including melanoma. So if you or someone in your family has a history of cancer, whether that's melanoma or something else, you can be seen without having to make a prior appointment. We do recommend calling to schedule a time to come in, but you can avoid the wait list of waiting for the genetic counselor and have your testing expedited. The genetic test results are all reviewed by a genetic counselor, so you still are getting, that review. And if you test positive, you're advised to come back in to meet with a genetic counselor, but it helps us to avoid some of the longer wait times that we have since there's limited genetic providers available. I think that's the last of it. If anyone has any questions.
I guess you don't want to get into the topic of intervention.
What do you mean?
Well, finding that there is a deleterious mutation and then what to do about it. How many people, how broadly to go test it.
Right. Well, touched on that a little bit, just the fact that when someone tests positive, there are preventative options. Of course, the funny thing that comes up with melanoma is And people often ask about things like diet, lifestyle changes they can make. Very rarely is there something specific to carrying a genetic mutation that's different than what we would tell the average person. We would tell you to wear sunscreen. We would tell you to wear a hat, just like you've been told today by everyone. The bigger picture is, potentially it could mean more frequent screenings. Generally, it's also just kind of the lower threshold. Once we identify that you carry this predisposition, if you see something atypical, take it seriously and go into the doctor. We don't want anyone to be living with anxiety, but we do want you to be aware of your risk, and so that can be part of the idea of doing the testing, is to know that if there's something we need to be on the lookout for. And then again, more broadly, just because these gene mutations can be associated with multiple types of cancers, maybe you've already had melanoma and you feel like, well, I know I've had it, I know I'm at risk, but what if that melanoma genetically is also linked to pancreatic cancer, and you didn't have that in your family, you didn't know that? It might be helpful in expanding how we screen you for other types of cancers too. Yes?
What about the correlation with Parkinson's disease? Hearing that in the, I don't know exactly how definitive that is, but I'm hearing about Parkinson's disease. I think there's the likelihood of melanoma, and if you have melanoma, maybe there's a greater likelihood of Parkinson's disease.
I'm not familiar with that. She was asking about potential link between Parkinson's disease and melanoma, and I have to be honest, I have not heard that. My expertise lies pretty specifically in cancer, and that's not something I've come across, so I don't want to give a wrong answer.
I think it's the overlap of the melanin synthesis pathway and the treatment of Parkinson's that are related, not the diseases.
Okay.
Do you understand the difference?
Yeah.
Yes, it's the treatment.
It's treatment.
Yeah, like I said, they share a pathway through melanin synthesis. And as a result, people think that if you take drugs for Parkinson's, it'll cause you to get melanoma, but that's not true.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, I haven't heard of any genetic link between the two.
There seems to be on AI, on your phone, if you want to look it up, a little bit of something there. I have a melanoma patient who also has Parkinson's disease. For what that's worth, probably nothing. But yeah, I don't know if there's, that was the first, when I heard it, the first thing I thought of was exactly what Dr. Essner said. Something about the dopamine and the, yeah. Like, I don't think we're going to cover that topic today.
Yeah. Indeed, there are only one patient, Parkinson. Yeah, and the other one with Parkinson had a Merkel. So it's like a really not.
Yeah, and I don't think those represent an increase of anything. They're just two things that happen.
It just happened together.
I think in the same way that you get older and you're diagnosed with cancer, you might get older and you're diagnosed with Parkinson's.
All right, well, I guess first thing I would say, I hope to share this with everybody, that today's a good day. I'm very grateful for this day. I got up this morning, and I'm going to be moving along. And so I just want to start by saying that it's probably something we should all remind ourselves of on an ongoing basis. A lot of shit going on. I'm sorry, Andrea. I promised my wife I wouldn't cuss, and there I go. Anyway. We did our crying 3 years ago when our daughter was diagnosed with breast cancer and had a bilateral mastectomy. And so by the time June 24 last year, when I discovered a walnut-sized lump underneath my left arm, and it was referred to City of Hope. City of Hope keeps coming up. And you do all the tests, the prodding, everything, the process. It was August, and by that time, it had grown 10 to 15 times larger. I couldn't put my arm down, I couldn't sleep at night. This is when I start whining. So just tell me, shut up, David. But at that point, when I was diagnosed, it was advanced stage 3. And Dr. Fainsad, my surgeon at the time, said 15 years ago he would have given me 3 to 6 months. What would the world do without me after 3 to 6 months? I just could not imagine it. But that got my eyes open. But my response to that immediately was righteous anger. I was going to be vindictive, Old Testament, spare no one. I was going to kill every one of these things. Every last one. I was going to chase them down. I didn't realize I had such a dark side. So my body was the instrument, and immunotherapy, that was my weapon. At that point, surgery was not really an option because of the size it had grown. I was having a hard time with the word where you do the meds before you do the surgery. Neoadjuvant. Thank you. What would I do without you? And so I started on Epi-Nivo. First month of Epi-Nivo was, I worked a little, but I was pretty much in bed a lot. And what I realized and was told to me at that point was that there was a war. There was a war going on in my body. And can I just remind you, I was going to kill every one of those. Everyone. But my body was going, okay, so you got to lay down. You got to lay down for a minute. And just a visceral sense of it was that I remember one day I woke up and the whole left side of my body was swollen. And I can't remember the description. The nurse called it some kind of an explosion or whatever. But it was basically a massive killing, All my good guys got together and they attacked all the bad guys, and my lymph system didn't know what to do with them all. And so basically I swelled from my foot all the way up to my shoulder. And then it cleared gradually, but that helped me to understand the battleground that I was going to wage and I was going to fight. And did I say already? I'm going to kill every one of those. And that's still my attitude about it. So I'd fast forward and say that was at 12 months and my body had adapted. Thank God for Zofran and any other topicals that I could use. Basically, 2 days out of the month throughout all that, it was a rinse and wash cycle. I was pretty close to the bathroom most of the time. And I lost 15 pounds. I was a little bit like a coat on a hanger. I don't have a lot to spare anyway. But we figured that out. And can I just mention?
You were going to kill every one of them.
Yeah, but I was just going to say nurses are incredible. I married a nurse, but I would go to immunotherapy and sorry, those were my people, and they helped get me through. Sorry, I thought I was done with the crying. So that's a year in. Basically, we're going to go a year in and then evaluate where we are with the surgical options and see where things were. I'd had 2 whole body scans during that time. It had shrunk dramatically. I had one here that I think my new word then was imperceptible on the whole body scan. It was my new favorite word. I used it in every sentence no matter what I was doing during that time. I just love the idea of killing that. Anyway, sorry. And so it was working. Then a little real life came into play, which is my second point in terms of advocating. When my insurance decided to no longer cover City of Hope. This was right when I was going to end up having a consult with my surgeon and oncologist to try to figure out next steps. And it ended up being that they referred me to a brain cancer specialist, which I called them directly and informed them I had 2 brain scans. The first one was a relief because I found out I did, in fact, have a brain. I'm not sure which one of the Wizard of Oz guys had a brain, but anyway, I had one. It wasn't just air going through one ear to the other. But no cancer in my brain, so I was concerned about who was going to be referring me to what. So I started advocating, anger and advocating. These are key words for me, for myself. And that's when the blessing of St. John's and coming in contact with these 2 knuckleheads. And little did I know that Dr. Margolin had spent, 30 plus years at City of Hope, so I couldn't get away from City of Hope. And, or he couldn't get away from me. And we met, and I remember that first meeting, and that was a whirlwind, because you guys were clear about it. You looked at it and said, I think you've got, and you got what you can from the immunotherapy at that point. And Dr. Essner said, so I think we need to go in and do the surgery. So he had an interesting weight loss program, which was going to remove all the lymph nodes underneath my left arm, and of which he did. And by the way, more nurses, that incredible. I'm sticking with the shark attack story for my, it was a very little shark and somehow got under my arm. That's my scar story. And that was very successful. And it allowed me to be able to feel like I'd really rounded the corner, and we ended up, Andre and I ended up landing in a place when we were very uncertain about what the next steps were going to be. And that's where the advocating really came into play, because it had nothing to do with the docs, the treatment, the options. It had to do with these other people who meet in another office and had to make some healthcare decisions, of which I was going to be on the short end of the stick for that. So that would be advocate, advocate, advocate. Every time I had a side effect about anything during any of the treatment, I would make sure to call the nurse navigator. I like that term. And they would call me right back and help me out with some options in terms of that. So during the last part of this time, I ended up having a friend of mine who I ended up finding. I'd been worked with him, and he's been a friend of mine for a long time. That he was also a member of the club that neither of us wanted to be a part of. And we would chat and get together for coffee and whatever our bodies could tolerate. And we would whine and complain and just talk about new treatment options. But 2 things we always did. One was that sorry. We always talked about those who cared for us. Having been on the other side with our daughter going through it, the idea of being able to see, I mean, I'll speak for myself. When I know I have cancer, I have options. The docs say, you make a decision, you're resolute. This is what we're going to do. It's really very selfish in that regard if you think about it. This is what you're going to do. But when you're watching it and you're living with it, and you're having to try to figure out how to support somebody that you love and care for, there's a part of that you're not sure what to do. It's like, what happens if your partner is really frustrated, angry, and pissed off? Can they really come and talk to you about that? Well, no. You know why? Because you have cancer, and we can't talk about that kind of stuff, right? And the very thing that's so much important to do is to be able to have that and be able to have those discussions, and for my support to be able to then have their support. So we would always be grateful for those that were there for us. And I want to thank you, Andrea. Thank you for being there.
All been there.
Anyway. The last thing we would talk about every time we met is that we would talk about the future. And you have to talk about the future. If you stay where you are in the present, I mean, it is important to be, I'm a therapist. I'm all about being present. Let's be present, you know, be present. Talk about the future, because there's got to be a future. And Jeffy would talk about the idea he was going to buy one of those fancy vans, you know, the camper vans, the Mercedes ones, you know, put a couple of surfboards on top. He was going to head down the coast of Baja and find the waves and then just pull over. And, you know, that was his dream and what he was going to be doing. So we'd make up all sorts of stories and go online and see what the best deal on one of those camper vans was. For me, we just celebrated our 37th wedding anniversary. She's never going to forgive me for this. And we went back to visit our daughter in Rhode Island, our 3-year-old grandson, Oliver James, and we went trick-or-treating. And I was a scurvy dog pirate searching for treasure. I can show you pictures later. Anyway, it reminded me of not only what I have, but the future that I have as well. And that is such an important thing, because this is today and this is it, but I am not, and you hear this all the time, I'm not defined by cancer. It is not my cancer. That is the enemy, and I will kill it. I will use my pirate sword and I will kill it. And nothing is going to keep me from that future. Angry, advocate, and the future. Those are my things that I hold on to. And lastly, I would just say, live your life between your scans. Sorry, I'm so long-winded.
First thing I want to say is I'm going to give you some good news. And that is, I was diagnosed in 2004 with stage 4 metastatic melanoma. So you got a long way to go still.
I knew he was going to do this.
Without a doubt. I mean, and so many things you said resonated.
You are
with
my
me.
brother.
You are indeed. And so I'll never forget when I lived a lot of lessons from my melanoma. First was you got to see your dermatologist several times a year, at least once or twice. I went to see mine and we had skipped a time, and that's when I got a call. I had a melanoma. I didn't think it was anything until I went to see Dr. Essner at St. John's, and I said, get off at the 3rd floor, and it said, John Wayne Cancer Institute. And all of a sudden, I had cancer, not just melanoma. So from then on, mine was already deep when they found it, and it had already spread to the lymph nodes when the melanoma was removed. I went to a support group at the, it was in Santa Monica at the time, and I remember you walk in and say what your diagnosis, what's your name, and I said my name and my diagnosis, and a woman in the group told me, that's the worst thing you can have. So immediately I'm saying, oh, I'm in trouble, what am I gonna do?
Very supportive.
One of the things I learned, and that I would tell all of you here, and we just spoke about, believe the diagnosis, but never the prognosis, because we're all different human beings, and we don't know what's gonna happen. I was told, thank goodness by no one at St. John's, I was told that I had 6 to 10 months to live, and that was it. You don't have stage 4. This was in 2004. Things are very different today. You said something about, I never believed it. I said, I have too much to do yet, which is what you're talking about. What was his name? Aldous Huxley said, cancer, he talked about not letting your fire go out. In other words, you got to find things that still give you joy in life that you really want to do. And then here's a question we heard about the vaccine. Peter Boasberg, who was my oncologist, who some of you might know, he's not practicing now, and he said there's a vaccine study at Keck, USC Keck. Why don't you try that? It can't do any harm. And so I went, and it was, they had to freeze my leg for it, and then the nurse or the doctor would throw in the syringe, and I'd get very sick that night. I'd get a temperature and a fever, and that was proof that it was working, which there's some old, and it was working. And so it was a 16 course every 2 weeks I'd have to go in, and then I had my CT PET scans as part of the procedure, what I was doing, and I remember it was, they found tumors in my left lung already. And that began a series of surgeries for 2 years. I was lucky, real lucky, and I learned a new word. It became my word was resectable. Now, I love that word. That means that it can be cut out. You had something that could be cut out.
Right.
You know?
You love that word, I think.
And it was so important. And so the tumors in my lung weren't near the heart, so they could get them. Remember how big that tumor in my colon, and it was huge, but it was resectable, the tumors in my intestine. I even had a tumor in my buttock. I mean, who gets a tumor in your buttock? I had them. And then, all of a sudden, there were no more tumors. Now, I had turned, and my other favorite word is NED. No evidence of disease. Those are the things we like to hear. So a few things. I did do a lot of research. I looked at different places. So getting a second opinion. I had a third opinion. And we spoke about Dr. Ziegelbaum and Dr. Hody and both of them told me, listen, there's no chemotherapy at this time. There's no that's going to help you. The only thing you can do is get scans and see if it lights up, the PET scan. If it does, and if it's resectable, get it removed. So I was lucky. For the first 2 years, every 3 months, so it's 4 times a year, I had a CT PET scan. And then after about 2 or 3 years, for whatever reason, NED. And that happened once, so I did 5 years, then don't get it only once a year, then every 3 years, and then every 10 years. And we just did one just to check, but it's been over 20 years. So things that are important. I went to a place, I looked at alternative things, and that's one of the questions I want to ask all. Has any research done? I went to a place called the Optimum Health Institute in San Diego. What was it? It was a place not fancy. You'd go and we would, it was a raw food diet. We spoke about mine, just raw food, small portions, and drinking a lot of wheatgrass. And then also we had a juice fast. Now I've talked to physicians, they absolute bunk. It's not going to change your, I don't know. Did it help me? I think it helped me help my own immune system, maybe, which helped. But while I was there, I'll tell a fun story. Humor. I read Cousins' book on when he was at UCLA. And you know the book people know about Norman Cousins? Excuse me? Yes, he wrote it. He wrote it, and he was at UCLA, and he went in, and he talked about the importance of humor and laughter, and he'd watch Laurel and Hardy movie. I questioned that until I was at this place, the Optima Health. And I got to know a guy there who was there a long time, and he had chosen. He showed, and one of the things, when someone says they had cancer, but what kind of cancer, what stage was it? And he showed me photos of his scans, and he had lung cancer, and there were those tumors. And then he said, but he decided to do something completely different. It was Joanna Budwig. She's a physicist, someone's shaking that. And he did a treatment of cottage cheese and oil, completely different than anything else. I thought he was crazy, but that's what he done. He wasn't seeing. Now, I'm not saying this to say everyone should try alternative things, but so 6 months later, I'm back, and I'm in kind of like a living room area, and he comes, Lenny, look at this. And I looked at his scans, and they were clear. And he said, and he started laughing. And he always was laughing. And he said, now there's one other thing that's not so good that's happening. And he kept laughing. I said, his name was Derek. What is it, Derek? And he shook his head. My penis is shrinking. Now, if someone can laugh at a shrinking penis, I mean, to me, that's astounding. And he lived, I knew him, that was 10 years ago. So the point of humor, I think, is really strong. What else? If there are any things, I kind of trusted my instincts with a lot of things. I'm glad that Dr. Essner was there to cut out those things. I had good, maybe bad luck that I got the cancer, and then good luck with things after that. So one of the things for everyone is there's a lot of things happen. We just don't know. I guess one last thing I would say is people would sometimes tell me, you're a better person because you had cancer. And I'd look at them and say, maybe it's true, but my advice to everyone I ever met is find another way to become a better person. So I don't know if there are questions for us that anyone has.
So with that, we will conclude our symposium. I thank the speakers and Dr. Essner, my partner in crime, and the wonderful patients and their families, and the Borsteins, who I think had to take off, and are taking off now, and Eleanor and David, and Aneda and Xing, and our other sponsors, and the MRF, of course. That's all I'm going to say.
Anyway, well, thank you guys again for attending.
And thanks to the virtual audience, too, whoever you are.